He leaned in close enough that she could smell the bourbon on his breath, and smiled the way men smile when they know they have an audience. "Still fetching coffee for someone else's dreams, Evelyn?" The words landed in the middle of the Astoria Royale's grand ballroom. Crystal chandeliers overhead, 300 people in black tie. The kind of room where reputations are made or destroyed in a single sentence. Brandon Hayes said it loud enough for the table nearest them to hear. Loud enough to matter. He wanted witnesses. He always did. Evelyn Carter felt her spine go rigid. Her champagne glass was in her hand, and she gripped it the way a person grips something when they're deciding whether to throw it or hold on. She held on. She always held on. If you've ever had someone publicly remind you of who you used to be, just to make themselves feel bigger, then you already know what was moving through her chest in that moment. And if you've ever been the one standing there, smile frozen, heart hammering, while the room quietly watches to see what you'll do next, then this story belongs to you. Stay until the end. What happens next will change how you see everything. And if this story finds you tonight, like it finds so many people in the quiet hours, hit that like button, drop your city or country in the comments so I can see how far this has traveled, and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming. These stories go places people don't expect. Now, let's go back to the beginning of that night. Evelyn had worn the navy dress because it was practical. That was the whole reason. It packed flat, it didn't wrinkle under a coat, and it had pockets, which in her experience were worth more than any designer label at events like this. The Astoria Royale's annual partnership gala was not her idea of an enjoyable evening. It was work. Expensive, chandelier-lit, champagne-soaked work, but work nonetheless. She had spent 11 days building the agenda for this event. 11 days coordinating between Sterling Capital's legal team, their communications department, the venue's event staff, and the 3 separate PR firms who each believed they were the most important person in any given room. She had drafted the remarks that Sterling's managing director, Robert Hale, would deliver at 9 o'clock. She had confirmed the catering substitutions for 2 board members with dietary restrictions that the venue had managed to lose twice. She had triple-checked the seating arrangement after someone's executive assistant called at 4 in the afternoon to announce that 2 of the guests had, quote, a history, and could not be placed within eye line of each other. That was Evelyn's job. Not glamorous. Not the kind of thing that gets credited in the program. But without her, the whole evening would have unraveled inside of 40 minutes. She knew that. Robert Hale knew that. A handful of people at Sterling Capital knew that. Everyone else at this party assumed she was someone's plus one. She had learned, a long time ago, to stop being bothered by that assumption. Or she had learned to tell herself she wasn't bothered. There was a difference between the two things, and she was honest enough with herself to know which one was actually true on nights like tonight. She was working the edge of the room the way she always did, tablet in hand, earpiece in one ear, keeping track of which Sterling Capital partners still needed to make contact with which Moretti Global representatives before the formal portion of the evening began. When she heard the laugh first, she recognized it immediately. There are certain laughs that stay with a person, not because they're beautiful, because they're designed to carry. Brandon Hayes had a laugh like that, loud enough to be heard across a cocktail party, constructed to make whoever was near him feel included, and occasionally deployed as a weapon without the target ever quite being able to prove it. She turned before she could stop herself. He was across the room, near the bar, one hand wrapped around a glass of something amber, the other hand gesturing expansively at whoever he was talking to. He was wearing a suit that cost more than her first month's rent in the apartment she'd taken after leaving him. His hair was the same. His posture was the same. That particular way he had of taking up space, shoulders back, chin slightly lifted, as if the room had been arranged for his benefit. He hadn't seen her yet. For approximately 4 seconds, Evelyn considered the exit. She knew where both exits were. She always knew. Old habit. Not anxiety, she'd told herself for years. Just thoroughness. But the earpiece crackled and Robert Hale's voice came through asking whether the Moretti representatives had made it to the East Wing reception room, and Evelyn remembered that she was working and that leaving was not an option, and that Brandon Hayes was one person in a room of 300, and she was a professional, and she was fine. She was fine. She answered Hale, confirmed 2 of the Moretti team had checked in, and began moving toward the East Wing. That was when Brandon turned, scanned the room with the casual confidence of a man who had never once walked into a room and wondered if he belonged there, and found her. The recognition moved across his face in stages. First a blink, the recalibration. Then something that wasn't quite a smile. Then he said something to the woman beside him, a tall blonde in a red dress who laughed on cue, and then he was moving toward Evelyn with the particular energy of a man who has decided that an encounter is going to happen and has already written the script. Evelyn kept walking. Not running, walking, measured, professional. He intercepted her anyway. Evelyn Carter. He said her name like it was a punchline he'd been sitting on. I was wondering if I'd see you tonight. She stopped because stopping was less awkward than trying to walk around him, and because 3 members of the catering staff were passing within earshot, and because she had spent 3 years learning that the best response to Brandon Hayes was not the one her nervous system wanted to produce. Brandon. That was all she said. He looked at her the way men look at things they've already categorized and filed away. His eyes moved, just briefly, over the navy dress, the tablet, the earpiece, and she watched him assemble his conclusion in real time, which was perhaps the most insulting part of the whole thing. You're working the event, he said. Not a question. I organized the event, she said. There was a fraction of a pause. Of course you did. The words were pleasant, the tone was not. You always were the most detail-oriented woman in any room. He glanced at the tablet. Still over at Sterling? Yes. Still in the, what was it, executive support role. She had a title. She had always had a title. Executive Senior Coordinator, which was the kind of title that got invented when a company wanted to pay someone for 5 roles without admitting they needed to hire 5 people. She had stopped explaining what the title actually meant approximately 2 years into the job, because the explanation always required other explanations, and people's attention tended to wander around the 3rd sentence. Something like that, she said. Brandon nodded slowly, in the way that people nod when they're waiting for the nodding itself to communicate what they don't want to say out loud. His date materialized at his elbow. Up close, she was younger than Evelyn had initially registered, with the carefully composed expression of someone who had learned that her job at events like this was to look interested without saying anything that might redirect attention. This is Cassandra, Brandon said. Cassandra, this is Evelyn. We dated for a while back when we were both, he smiled, figuring things out. Evelyn extended her hand. Nice to meet you. Cassandra shook it with the polite disinterest of someone who had never once felt threatened by an ex-girlfriend and therefore didn't need to perform warmth. So how long have you been doing the event side? Brandon asked. Back to her. He was more interested in this conversation than she was, which was its own kind of information. I'm not on the event side. I work in contract development. Right. Another nod. The nodding was really doing a lot of work. You always said you wanted to get into strategy. Is that... He paused, tilted his head. Is that something that's happened, or are you still working toward that? Evelyn looked at him directly. I work in contract development and negotiation. That is strategy. Of course. He smiled, and the smile was the version that had taken her 18 months to recognize as condescension with good teeth. I just remember you had bigger ambitions, back when we were together. A slight laugh, conspiratorial, directed at Cassandra. She had all these plans, was going to run a division by 30. I'm 31, Evelyn said. Right. A pause. Well, there's still time. And there it was. The room didn't stop. The chandeliers didn't dim. The string quartet in the corner didn't hit a dramatic chord. It was just a man in an expensive suit, holding a glass of bourbon, telling a woman that her life was smaller than she'd planned for it to be, and enjoying the telling. Evelyn's jaw tightened fractionally. It was the only thing that moved on her face. It was nice to see you, Brandon, she said, and began to step around him. Still fetching coffee for someone else's dreams, Evelyn? The words came out just as she was turning, which meant they landed at the exact moment when she didn't have a face to hold steady, and the nearest table of people, 4 of them, Sterling Capital executives she had worked with for 2 years, all turned slightly, the way people turn when they register that something sharp has happened in their vicinity. She stopped. She turned back. Brandon was smiling. Not cruelly. That was the sophistication of it. Not a sneer, just a smile, warm almost, as if he'd said something affectionately teasing rather than deliberately designed to humiliate her in front of people who would be at her office Monday morning. And this was the moment, this exact moment, when Evelyn Carter was running the calculation every woman runs in situations like this. The cost of speaking against the cost of silence. The professional consequence against the personal one. The version of herself that walks away intact versus the version that says what she actually wants to say. She opened her mouth, and a voice came from her left, quiet, unhurried, carrying the particular quality of someone who had never in their adult life needed to raise their volume to command attention. Ms. Carter. She turned. Vincent Moretti was standing approximately 3 feet away, and she had absolutely no idea how long he had been there. He was taller than she remembered from their previous meetings, or perhaps it was simply that she was used to seeing him seated at conference tables, where his physical presence got somewhat compressed into the formality of the setting. Standing here, in this open space of the ballroom, he occupied a different kind of weight. The charcoal suit was immaculate in the specific way that money achieves when it stops announcing itself. Dark eyes, jaw that hadn't relaxed in what appeared to be his entire life, and an expression that was completely unreadable, which in Evelyn's experience was rarer than people thought. Most people's faces gave something away. Vincent Moretti's face gave nothing it hadn't decided to give. Mr. Moretti. She was surprised, but she didn't let it show. Or she tried not to. He looked at Brandon. Not at Evelyn. At Brandon. And the look lasted approximately 2 seconds, which in that particular variety of silence felt considerably longer. I don't believe we've been introduced, Vincent said to Brandon. Not a request. An observation. Brandon recalibrated. This happened in real time. She could see it. The reassessment of a situation that had just shifted beneath him. He extended his hand with the automatic confidence of a man who believed his handshake was one of his better qualities. Brandon Hayes, Hayes Meridian Capital. Vincent shook it without breaking the economy of the gesture. Vincent Moretti. The name registered. She watched it register on Brandon's face. The slight adjustment of the shoulders, the recalibration of the smile. Hayes Meridian Capital was not a small firm, but it existed in a different category than the Moretti name, and Brandon was smart enough to understand that distinction in the time it took to shake a hand. I've heard of Moretti Global, Brandon said. Good work in the infrastructure sector. Thank you. Vincent turned to Evelyn. I wanted to apologize for being late. The team is waiting in the East Wing. And then, with no apparent shift in tone or expression, he said to Brandon, Ms. Carter is responsible for every major contract agreement between Sterling Capital and our organization over the past 14 months. We don't sign anything until she's reviewed it. I hope I'm not pulling her away from an important conversation. The silence that followed was approximately 3 seconds. Brandon said, Not at all. His smile had changed. It was still present. He was too practiced for it to disappear, but something behind it had shifted. Cassandra was looking at Evelyn with an expression that had moved from polite disinterest to something considerably more attentive. Ms. Carter. Vincent gestured toward the East Wing, and the gesture was so natural, so simply executive, that Evelyn fell into step beside him before she'd entirely processed what had just happened. They walked, 20 feet, 30, out of the immediate orbit of Brandon Hayes, through the edge of the ballroom, past the string quartet, who were playing something she couldn't identify, and toward the corridor that led to the East Wing reception rooms. Neither of them said anything for the length of that walk. When they reached the corridor, quieter, removed from the main room, the sound of the party becoming ambient behind them, Evelyn finally exhaled. She hadn't realized she'd been holding the breath. It came out longer than she expected. He wasn't on the guest list, she said. That was the first thing she said. Not thank you, not how did you know, just the practical observation because her brain defaulted to logistics when it was trying to stabilize itself. I noticed, Vincent said. She looked at him. How long were you standing there? Long enough. You didn't have to do that. He glanced at her, a brief, direct look. I know. She waited for the rest of it, the explanation, the caveat. Something that would make what he'd done make the kind of sense that things usually make, the kind with a transactional structure underneath it. 3 years at Sterling Capital had taught her that gestures like that one usually had architectural support, quid pro quos, favor banks, delayed invoices. He didn't offer any of it. The team is actually waiting, he said, but there's no emergency. I fabricated the urgency. She stared at him. And then, despite everything, the champagne she hadn't finished, the earpiece still in her ear, the 300 people 40 feet away, the navy dress she'd chosen because it was practical. She almost laughed. Not quite, but almost. "You fabricated the urgency," she repeated. It seemed like the cleanest exit available. He looked at her with an expression that was almost, not quite, apologetic. "I hope that wasn't an overreach." She thought about that. About whether it was an overreach. About Brandon's face when Vincent said her name like it was the name of someone who mattered. About the feeling, which she had not yet named to herself, of having someone step into a moment she'd been alone in for 3 years. "No," she said. "It wasn't." The corridor hummed with the distant music. Somewhere behind them, the evening continued, contracts and handshakes, and people performing their best versions of themselves under crystal light. Out here, for the first time that night, Evelyn Carter breathed. The East Wing reception room smelled like fresh linen and cold coffee. Someone had set up a small meeting arrangement. 4 chairs around a low table, a carafe that had been sitting out long enough to lose its heat, a folder of documents that no one had touched. Evelyn clocked all of it in the first 3 seconds. Old habit, the kind that kept her employed. There was no team waiting. Vincent had told the truth about fabricating the urgency, which meant the room itself was the fabrication. Empty, quiet, deliberately removed from the noise of the ballroom 40 feet and 1 corridor away. She should have been irritated by that. She registered the impulse to be irritated by that. But when she turned to say something about it, Vincent was already moving toward the carafe, lifting it, testing the weight of it, setting it back down with the expression of a man who had made peace with disappointing coffee. "It's cold," he said. "I figured." He pulled out one of the chairs and sat. Not with the practiced ease of someone performing casualness, but with the actual movement of a man who was tired and wasn't going to pretend otherwise. That surprised her more than anything else he'd done that evening. She had been in 7 meetings with Vincent Moretti over 14 months. She had watched him negotiate, deflect, redirect, and occasionally dismantle an argument with such minimal visible effort that it took the other party several minutes to realize what had happened. She had never once seen him look tired. She sat across from him. Not beside him. Across. He noticed. She saw him notice. Neither of them commented on it. "You've been at Sterling Capital for how long?" he asked. 4 years in March. And before that? It wasn't quite a question. It had the shape of a question without the inflection of one, which was either a verbal habit or a technique. With Vincent, she had learned not to assume. "Before that, I was at Langfield Associates for 2 years. Before that, graduate school." She paused. "You could find all of that in the company file." "I'm not asking because I need the information," he said. "I'm asking because I want to hear how you say it." She looked at him steadily. "That's an unusual reason." "Probably." The corridor outside was quiet. Distantly, she could still hear the string quartet, a low, pleasant murmur of music that meant nothing specific and served the room the way wallpaper serves a room, present without demanding attention. She had 3 items still on her event checklist that needed to be confirmed before 9 o'clock. She was aware of this, the way she was aware of most pending obligations, as a low-grade pressure at the base of her skull that didn't go away until the items got crossed off. She didn't reach for her tablet. "What did you mean?" she said. "When you told him I review everything before you sign." "I meant it literally. I've never been in a room with you during final contract review." "No," he said. "But Marcus runs every document past me before execution, and I've sent back 3 separate agreements in the past year with annotations. 2 of those annotations flagged issues that your preliminary review had already identified and routed to the legal team." He looked at her without particular drama. "I read the internal routing notes, Miss Carter. I know whose name appears on the problem identifications." She was quiet for a moment. "Most people at your level don't read routing notes. Most people at my level don't read the contracts either. That's why they need people like you." He said it without flattery, the way someone states a load-bearing fact. "It's also why I tend to pay attention to who in a negotiation is actually doing the work, as opposed to who is standing at the front of the room collecting credit for it." She absorbed that. It landed differently than she expected. Not like a compliment, which she could have deflected, but like an observation made by someone who had been watching for a long time without her knowledge. That was a more complicated feeling. Not uncomfortable, exactly. But not comfortable either. Robert Hale runs the Sterling Capital side of those negotiations, she said. Robert Hale is a competent managing director who surrounds himself with people who compensate for his weaknesses, Vincent said. That's actually a skill. Not everyone can do it. But it means that the people doing the compensating tend to be invisible to everyone except the people who are paying close enough attention. And you pay close attention. It's kept me alive, he said, and the simplicity of it, the way it sat in the room without apology or elaboration, made her chest do something she didn't immediately categorize. She had read about Vincent Moretti before their first meeting 14 months ago. She had done what she always did before any major client engagement, thorough, methodical research. The kind that went past the publicly facing profile and into the court records and the newspaper archives and the analyst reports that didn't make it into press releases. She knew what the Moretti name carried. She knew what legitimate empire meant and what it was built on top of. She had gone into that first meeting clear-eyed and professionally prepared and faintly wary, the way any sensible person is faintly wary when sitting across the table from a man whose grandfather had controlled 3 port operations through means that didn't require legal documentation. She had expected something that confirmed what she'd read. What she'd gotten was a man who asked better questions than anyone else in the room and listened to the answers without checking his phone. That had thrown her. 14 months later, she was still, if she was honest, slightly thrown. "The man in there," Vincent said, and she knew immediately who he meant. "How long ago?" 3 years. "Who ended it?" "I did." Something moved through his expression. Not surprise, but something adjacent to it. A recalibration of a minor assumption. "He doesn't know that," Vincent said. "He knows it," Evelyn said. "He's just constructed a version of events where it happened differently. He's been doing that for 3 years. She looked down at her hands, then back up. "Brandon is very good at rewriting outcomes so that they support his preferred narrative." "How long were you together?" 2 years. The quiet stretched between them, not unpleasantly. Outside, the music shifted. Something slower, a key change she felt before she identified it. "He told people I left because the relationship wasn't going anywhere," she said, which was true. He just reversed the subject and the object. She paused. "I wasn't the one going nowhere." "No," Vincent said. "You weren't." She looked at him sharply, not because the words were wrong, but because they were immediate, offered without the usual male conversational pause, the slight delay that telegraphs someone working out whether a woman's statement is accurate before confirming it. Vincent said it the way he'd say the carafe was cold, as if the evidence had already been assembled and the conclusion was not in question. She didn't know what to do with that, so she let it sit. "I have 2 items on my checklist that need confirmation before 9, she said. "Robert's remarks need to be queued with the AV team, and I need to confirm that the Delacroix seat placement got corrected after the switch this afternoon." Vincent looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "All right." She stood. He stood. She had expected, she wasn't sure what she'd expected. Some protest, maybe. Some attempt to extend the conversation by another 10 minutes, the way men often tried to extend conversations that were going well for them. He didn't do that. He simply stood, adjusted his jacket, and moved toward the door with the same unhurried precision with which he did everything. "Miss Carter," he said at the door. She turned. "The Delacroix placement was corrected at 7:42. I overheard the venue coordinator confirm it on her radio when I was walking through the south corridor." He held the door. "One less item." She stared at him. "You overheard that?" "I told you. I pay attention." The rest of the evening ran the way Evelyn's events always ran, which was to say, it ran cleanly on the surface and with continuous invisible crisis management underneath. Robert Hale delivered his remarks at 9:03, which was within the acceptable margin, and he hit the 3 talking points she had built into the draft, and skipped the 4th one, which was also fine because the 4th one had always been optional. The Moretti Global representatives, 4 of them, polished and quiet, in the way of people who understood that the room was doing the work for them, shook the right hands in the right order. Evelyn moved through all of it with her earpiece and her tablet and her navy dress with pockets. And she was good at this, genuinely good at it, and she knew she was good at it, and that was supposed to be enough. She saw Brandon twice more during the evening. The first time he was at the bar again, which seemed to be his anchor point. He was talking to 2 men she didn't recognize, financial sector, by the suits, And he was using the voice he used when he was performing confidence rather than actually having it. The slightly elevated volume, the laugh that came half a beat early. She had spent 2 years learning to hear the difference between those two versions of Brandon Hayes. She wondered if Cassandra had started to learn it yet. The second time he was watching her. She was crossing the main ballroom, moving from the AV station back toward the east corridor, and she felt it before she located it. That particular quality of someone's attention that has weight to it, that presses on you from across a room. She tracked it to Brandon, standing near the south windows, not talking to anyone, watching her walk. His expression was the one she associated with him doing arithmetic. She didn't stop. She didn't alter her path. She walked the same line she'd been walking, at the same pace, and she felt his gaze on her shoulders until the corridor swallowed her. Her heart was going faster than she wanted it to. She stopped in the corridor, pressed her back against the wall beside a decorative sconce, and breathed for 4 counts. Not because she was upset, because she was angry, and she knew from experience that she had to metabolize the anger somewhere private before she took it back into the room, or it would come out sideways in the next 10 conversations. 3 years. She had rebuilt herself in 3 years. The apartment she'd found on her own, the promotion she'd worked for at a company that initially hired her for what felt like a temporary role, the slow, patient process of learning to trust her own judgment again after 2 years with someone who had made her second-guess all of it. She had done all of that. And Brandon Hayes could walk into one room and make her heart rate climb just by looking at her from across it. That was the part she hated. Not the words he'd said, the physiological response to his presence, the body's memory of something the mind had already decided to leave behind. She breathed. She straightened. She put the earpiece back in and went back to work. It was 10:50 when the event formally wound down, and 11:15 by the time Evelyn had confirmed the venue checklist with the coordinator, collected the materials from the East Wing reception room, confirmed the AV team had the Sterling Capitol recording, and said the necessary goodbyes on Robert Hale's behalf, because Robert Hale had a car waiting and the attention span of a man who had already moved on to tomorrow's problems. The night air outside the Astoria Royale was cold in the specific New York way. Not brutally cold, but the kind that had opinions. It came off the street with something in it, exhaust and river and the faint smell of food from somewhere. She stood on the front steps waiting for the car service, her coat finally on, the tablet in her bag, the earpiece in her pocket. She heard the door behind her. She didn't have to turn to know it was Brandon. She recognized his footsteps. A particular rhythm, slightly heavy on the left side from an old running injury, the one he'd complained about the winter of their second year together. Bodies carried their own signatures. She'd stopped finding that remarkable a long time ago. Evelyn. She turned to because it would have been more awkward not to. He was alone. He'd left Cassandra somewhere, inside presumably, or already dispatched into a cab. His jacket was on, but his tie had been loosened, which on Brandon always meant he'd been drinking and had started to feel that the performance portion of the evening was over. "Brandon," she said, flat, not hostile, just a word. He came down 2 steps so they were on the same level. He looked at her differently than he had inside. Less of the audience calculation, more of the thing underneath it, whatever it was that Brandon Hayes looked like when he had stopped performing. She had never fully decided what that was, even after 2 years. "That was unexpected," he said. "Moretti." "Yes." "You're actually embedded in those negotiations." "I told you that," she said. "Inside." "I know, I just—" He stopped, adjusted something in his posture, started again. "I didn't know the scope of it." She looked at him. She had a response to that, several, arranged in descending order of civility, and she chose the one that would end the conversation fastest. "The scope of it is the same as it's been for 4 years. The only thing that changed is that you found out." He nodded. That nod again, the one that was carrying too much weight. "You seem good," he said. "You seem—" A pause. "You seem different." "I am different." "Is it the job or—" "It's everything," she said. "It's the 4 years that happened after I stopped organizing my life around someone else's comfort." She kept her voice level. Not cold. Level. There was a difference, and she'd had a long time to practice it. "It was good to see you, Brandon." She turned back toward the street, watching for headlights. "I shouldn't have said that," he said behind her. Inside, what I said. She was quiet for a moment. The car wasn't there yet. The street was doing its thing. Cabs, a delivery truck, two people in formal wear arguing about something half a block away. No, she said. You shouldn't have. I don't know why I... He exhaled. I saw you and you looked... He stopped it again. On Brandon, this halting quality was rare enough that she registered it. Like someone who doesn't need your approval anymore, she said. Not viciously, just as information. The silence behind her was a different quality than the silence before. She felt him absorb it. Yeah, he said finally, quietly. Something like that. The car came. She saw the headlights, confirmed the plate against the confirmation in her phone, picked up her bag. Good night, Brandon, she said, and walked down the remaining steps. She heard him say her name once more, just her name, nothing attached to it. But she had already reached the car, and the door was already open, and she got in. The back seat was warm and quiet. The driver said nothing, which she appreciated. She sat with her bag on the seat beside her and watched the city move past the window. The lights, the intersections, the slow hydraulic flow of late-night Manhattan doing its late-night Manhattan thing. She felt something she couldn't immediately classify. Not triumph, not quite. Something more like the particular exhaustion that comes after you've held something in for a long time and finally set it down. Not relief exactly, just less weight. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Unknown number. Manhattan area code. She almost didn't answer. It was nearly 11:30, and she had a 40-minute ride, and she was tired in the bone-level way that only event days produced. She answered. Ms. Carter. The voice was immediately recognizable, unhurried, carrying. I apologize for contacting you at this hour. She sat up slightly. Mr. Moretti? I wanted to confirm that the evening concluded without further complications. A pause. On the Sterling Capital side. She almost said, that is not something you would normally call to confirm. She didn't say it because it was obvious to both of them, and pointing out the obvious in a conversation with Vincent Moretti seemed like wasted energy. It concluded fine, she said. Robert's satisfied. The Moretti Global team, your team, made the right impressions with the partners they needed to make them with. Good. Another pause, this one slightly longer. I also wanted to say that what I did inside, the fabricated urgency, I want to be clear that I don't make a habit of inserting myself into situations I haven't been invited into. You mentioned that. I'm mentioning it again, because it merits repetition. He seemed to consider something. What happened in that room was, that particular kind of cruelty is deliberate. The public staging of it. It requires an audience or it doesn't work, which means it was designed. A brief, precise pause. I find that kind of engineering particularly offensive. Evelyn looked at the city going past. A red light. A corner bodega still open, its awning lit against the dark. Someone walking a dog. He's always been good at it, she said, and didn't know why she said it, because it was more than she'd intended to offer. I know, Vincent said. You don't know him. I know the type. I deal with that type in professional contexts regularly. Men who have learned that the surest way to elevate their position in a room is to reduce someone else's. She heard something shift on his end. Movement, maybe, or just the ambient sound of wherever he was. In business, I handle them efficiently. In personal contexts, I have less patience. You were patient enough tonight. I wasn't patient, he said. I was controlled. Those aren't the same thing. She sat with that for a moment. The light changed. The car moved forward. How did you get this number? She said. I asked Marcus for the event coordination contact. He gave me your direct line. A pause. I realize that's borderline inappropriate. It is borderline inappropriate. Yes. He didn't apologize. He also didn't retreat. Miss Carter, I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that whatever your answer is, it has no bearing on our professional relationship. None. I'm clear about that distinction. Her hand tightened slightly around the phone. All right. I would like to take you to dinner. Not a Sterling Capital dinner, not a Moretti Global dinner, not a business context of any kind. His voice was exactly as level as it always was, which somehow made the words land harder. I'd like to have a conversation with you that doesn't have a contract on the table between us. The car moved through an intersection. The driver adjusted the radio infinitesimally. She didn't answer right away. Not because she was calculating. She was past the age of strategic pausing for effect, and she suspected Vincent Moretti was past the age of being manipulated by it anyway. She didn't answer because she was actually sitting with the question, which was the kind of thing she'd learned to do in the 4 years since Brandon, in the slow, patient process of learning to not react before she'd actually decided. "I know what your name means," she said finally. "I know what it comes with." "Yes." "I'm not afraid of it," she said. And that was true. She'd examined that in herself a long time ago, across 14 months of meetings, and she'd found something that wasn't fear. "But I'm also not someone who makes decisions quickly just because someone asks me to." "I know that," he said. "That's not a coincidence. That quality is part of why I'm asking." She breathed. The city ran past the window, indifferent and luminous. "Give me time to think about it," she said. "Of course." And then, without drama, "Good night, Ms. Carter." "Good night, Mr. Moretti." She lowered the phone, held it in her lap. The car was moving north, and the lights were doing the thing New York lights do at this hour. Softening, spacing out, the density of the daytime city starting to relax into something that almost resembled quiet. She was still sitting with the phone in her lap when her own phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't an unknown number. This time it was a name she recognized immediately, and the name made her stomach pull tight in a way that had nothing to do with the cold outside or the conversation she'd just finished. It was Diane Ruiz, Sterling Capital's head of legal, calling at 11:43 on a gala night, which meant one thing: something was wrong. Evelyn answered before the second ring finished. "Diane, we have a problem." Diane's voice was the kind of flat that lawyers used when they were keeping the alarm out of it by force of professional habit. "The Moretti Global contract, the infrastructure framework we've been building toward for the past 8 months, the one that closes in 17 days. "I know the one," Evelyn said. Something cold was moving up the back of her neck. "Someone leaked the preliminary terms to a competitor. The specific competitor who's been trying to get a seat at the same table for the last 2 years and has been blocked out every time." Diane paused. "The information that got out. It's detailed enough that it didn't come from outside. It came from inside Sterling Capital." The car kept moving. The city kept doing its thing. Evelyn sat completely still. "How detailed?" she said. "Detailed enough to constitute a breach," Diane said. "Detailed enough that if Moretti Global finds out before we contain it, they can walk from the whole thing, and we will have nothing. 8 months, Evelyn. And the leak went out tonight, while everyone was at the gala. While everyone was watching the chandeliers and shaking hands and performing their best versions of themselves. While someone was doing something else entirely." "Who knows?" Evelyn said. "Right now, you, me, and Robert." A pause. "And whoever sent it." Evelyn looked out the window. The city was still doing exactly what it had been doing 5 minutes ago, and it felt completely different now. "I need you to send me everything you have," she said, "tonight." "Evelyn, send me everything, Diane. I'll be home in 20 minutes. She hung up, sat in the warm back seat with the phone in both hands. 17 days to close a contract worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and someone inside Sterling Capital had just handed the terms to a competitor. Someone who had been at the gala tonight, or who had a contact who had been at the gala tonight, which meant someone who had been standing in that ballroom under those chandeliers, shaking those hands, had been doing something else entirely. And Vincent Moretti had just asked her to dinner, and she had no idea yet whether those two facts were connected. She opened her email. The documents from Diane were already arriving, page after page of preliminary framework terms, each one time-stamped, each one a thread that led back somewhere inside Sterling Capital, and somewhere at the other end of that thread was a person who had decided that tonight, of all nights, this particular night, was the right moment to light the whole thing on fire. She started reading. She read for 3 hours. Not skimming, reading. The kind of reading that leaves marks on you, where you go back to the same paragraph 4 times not because you didn't understand it, but because you understood it too well, and you're looking for the place where you misread something, where the problem is smaller than it looks, where there's a version of this that isn't what it appears to be. There wasn't. Evelyn sat at her kitchen table in the apartment she'd chosen because it had good light and a reasonable commute, and a landlord who fixed things without being asked, still in the navy dress at 2:14 in the morning, her coat thrown over the chair she never actually used for sitting, and she read every document Diane had sent. The preliminary framework for the Moretti Global Infrastructure contract ran to 63 pages. What had been leaked was not a summary. It was not a general outline. It was 41 specific pages: the payment structure, the liability clauses, the timeline benchmarks, the 2 proprietary risk assessment methodologies that Sterling Capital's legal team had spent 4 months developing specifically for this deal. 41 pages. Sent from an internal Sterling Capital server. Routed through an anonymizing relay that someone had taken the trouble to set up in advance, which meant this was not a mistake. Not a moment of bad judgment, not someone accidentally forwarding an attachment to the wrong address. This was planned. She got up, poured water she didn't drink, stood at the kitchen window and looked at the street below. Quiet now. Just the occasional cab. A light on in the apartment across the way where someone was also apparently not sleeping. The competitor was Halverson Meridian Group. She knew the name. Everyone in New York's financial sector knew the name. A firm that had been circling the Moretti Global account for 2 years, getting blocked at every turn because Moretti Global had a preference for long-term partners, and Halverson had a reputation for extracting maximum value from short-term ones. They'd made 3 separate approaches through intermediaries in the past 18 months. She had written 2 of the response documents declining those approaches. She went back to the table, opened the routing information Diane had included. The documents had gone out at 9:47, which meant they went out while Robert Hale was still delivering his remarks. While the ballroom was full. While Evelyn herself was somewhere near the East Corridor with a checklist in one hand and the ambient music doing nothing for her heart rate. Someone at that event, or connected to someone at that event, had sent 41 pages of confidential material to Halverson Meridian Group while the champagne glasses were still full. She needed to think about who had access. Access to those 41 specific pages required clearance at the senior negotiation level. That narrowed the field considerably. It wasn't every employee at Sterling Capital. It wasn't even every senior employee. It was the people who had been directly embedded in the Moretti Global negotiation, legal, contract development, the small group of executives who had been at the table for the past 8 months. She opened a fresh document on her laptop and began to write names, not accusingly, analytically, who had been in which meeting, who had received which version of which document, who had the technical capability to set up the anonymizing relay, or who had the resources to pay someone else to do it. She wrote 7 names. She stared at the list for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and called Diane back. Diane answered on the second ring, which meant she hadn't been sleeping either. "Tell me you have something," Diane said. "I have a question," Evelyn said. "The relay. The anonymizing one. IT already looked at it?" "They're still looking. When they traced the originating server, which one was it?" A pause. She could hear Diane pulling something up. "Contract development server. Subdirectory 7. Evelyn's hand tightened around the phone. Subdirectory 7 was her team's working folder. "Who else has right access to that directory?" Evelyn said, and her voice was even, and she was very deliberately making it even, because the alternative was something she couldn't afford right now. "Evelyn? Who else has right access, Diane?" Another pause, longer. "You, Marcus Chen, and Robert's executive login has blanket access, but he doesn't actually use it. 3 names. Evelyn. Marcus. Robert's dormant login." "Is there any possibility," Evelyn said carefully, "that someone used Robert's executive login?" "It is checking for that." Diane's voice had changed. It was doing something careful now, the same kind of careful Evelyn was doing. "But Evelyn, I need to say something and I need you to hear it without say it. Robert is asking questions about the investigation, about who's been involved in the document management side." A breath. "He asked about you specifically." The kitchen was very quiet. The street outside had gone fully still. Somewhere in the building, a pipe made a sound and then stopped. "He asked about me. He said," and I'm telling you exactly what he said, word for word. He said, "How much unsupervised access has Evelyn had to the finalized framework documents?" Diane paused. Those exact words. Evelyn sat down. Not gracefully. She sat down the way a person sits down when their legs have made a decision before their brain caught up with it. The chair was hard under her, and the kitchen light was very bright, and the document on her laptop screen still had 7 names on it. "He's positioning me," she said. "I think it's possible that—" "Diane." She stopped. She made herself breathe. "I need you to tell me honestly what you think is happening." The silence on the other end was the kind that comes from someone choosing their words with the precision of someone who knows the words are going to matter. "I think," Diane said slowly, "that someone wanted this to look like it came from your part of the operation, and I think that person has been preparing for this for longer than tonight." The room was the same it had been an hour ago. The dress was the same dress. The city outside was still the city. Evelyn felt something move through her chest that she didn't have an immediate word for. Not panic. Panic was loud. This was cold and very quiet, the way water is quiet when it's deep enough. "I'll be in the office at 7, she said. "Don't let it close the relay trace without me present." "Evelyn, 7 o'clock, she said, and hung up. She sat at the kitchen table until 3 in the morning. She didn't go back to the documents. She sat and she thought, which was a different activity. And she was good at it. And she needed to be good at it right now more than she had needed to be good at anything in 4 years. Someone had stolen from a deal she had built, and then arranged the room so that when people started looking, they would look at her first. She was at the office at 6:40. The Sterling Capital offices had the particular quality of large financial sector spaces at 6:40 in the morning, lit, temperature-controlled, and populated by a very specific subset of the workforce. The ones who arrived before the building stopped feeling like their private property. She had always been one of those people. She had a key card that worked at 5:30 if she needed it to. She went directly to the IT department on the 4th floor rather than her own office on the 7th. The IT team had 2 people present at this hour, both of them clearly running on institutional adrenaline and bad coffee. The relay trace was still open on the main monitor. She sat down with them and she worked through it. Not delegating, working. She knew her way around a server directory the way most people in her position didn't, because she had taught herself 2 years ago when Sterling's IT department was understaffed and her team's documents kept getting misrouted. She had learned enough to be functional, which on a night like this meant she was considerably more useful than she was supposed to be. At 7:52, they found it. Not a relay. The relay was a distraction, well constructed, the kind of thing that would absorb hours of IT attention, while the actual mechanism sat somewhere quieter. The actual mechanism was a scheduled send, a document package assembled in advance, set to send at 9:47 from a user account with her team's server credentials. Not her account. Marcus Chen's account. She stared at the screen for what felt like a long time, but was probably 6 seconds. The IT lead, young, with the look of someone who had been awake for too long, said carefully, "This doesn't necessarily mean—" "I know what it doesn't necessarily mean," Evelyn said. "Print me everything. Every log entry, every timestamp, every access record. I need 2 copies." She had the copies in her bag by 8:15. She went to her office and she sat and she looked at the documents and she thought about Marcus Chen. Marcus Chen had been at Sterling Capital for 6 years. He had been on the Moretti global negotiation from the beginning. Longer than Evelyn, actually. He was methodical, reliable, and exactly the kind of person you trusted with sensitive material because he had never given anyone a reason not to. I was also quiet in the way that some people are quiet when they have a lot going on and they've decided not to talk about it. She thought about the past 3 months, the small signs she hadn't assembled into a pattern because she hadn't been looking for a pattern. Marcus arriving late on Tuesdays, 3 Tuesdays in a row, which she'd noticed and filed as personal circumstance. Marcus requesting access to the finalized framework documents twice in the same week when his existing access should have been sufficient. Marcus being the one to volunteer 3 weeks ago to consolidate the document versions into a single master directory. Subdirectory 7. She pressed her fingers against her eyes, hard enough to see the pressure colors. Then she heard footsteps in the corridor, the specific cadence of someone walking with purpose, not the casual drifting of early morning office traffic. And she dropped her hands and straightened and made her face do what her face needed to do. Robert Hale opened her door without knocking. I was in a different suit than last night, but the same quality of tension, controlled, precisely directed, the kind of tension that Robert carried when he was managing a situation he needed to stay ahead of. He was 61 years old and had been at Sterling Capital for 22 years, and he had, in that time, navigated 17 client crises. He was good at this. She had always respected that he was good at this. She looked at him and waited. "Evelyn," he said. He didn't sit. "I need to know where you are on this." "I've been here since 6:40 working the trace with IT," she said. "I have preliminary findings." Something moved in his face. Surprise, quickly managed. "You should have called me." "I'm telling you now." She didn't apologize for the sequence of it. The leak originated from Marcus Chen's account. Scheduled send, set up in advance. The relay was a misdirection. Robert was quiet for 3 seconds. "That's a significant claim." "It's what the logs show." She pushed the printouts across the desk toward him. 2 copies, one for legal. He looked at the documents without picking them up. His jaw was doing the thing it did when he was computing something he didn't want to compute out loud. "Have you spoken to Marcus?" "Not yet." "Don't." He looked up. "Let legal and HR handle the contact. If this gets—" He stopped, started again. "This deal cannot collapse. Do you understand the scope of what collapses if this deal collapses?" "I understand," she said. "Moretti Global cannot find out." She looked at him. "Robert, not until we have containment, not until we can demonstrate that the breach is isolated and the material hasn't been used." His voice was very flat. "The closing is in 17 days. If we go to Moretti with this now, before we have the full picture, they walk. We lose the deal, we lose the relationship, and we lose every future relationship that relationship would have generated. And if Halverson has already used the material," she said, "then we manage that when it's confirmed." "That's not—" She stopped herself. "Robert, if Vincent Moretti finds out we knew about a breach and concealed it, we are not concealing it. We are managing the timeline of disclosure." Robert picked up one of the copies of the log documents. "There is a difference." She looked at him, looked at the document in his hands, looked at his face, which was doing the thing it did when he had already made a decision and was explaining it rather than consulting about it. "I want that in writing," she said. Robert's expression shifted by a fraction. "What?" "Your instruction to delay disclosure to Moretti Global. I want it documented, signed." The silence between them had a texture to it. She had worked for Robert Hale for 4 years, and she had never directly challenged an operational decision, and they both understood that what was happening in this room right now was not the same as their previous 4 years. "Evelyn," he said, "let's not make this adversarial." "I'm not making it anything," she said. "I'm asking you to document the decision you're making so that there's a record of who made it and why." He set the document down. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read. Then he said, "You've been in contact with Moretti directly." It wasn't a question. She didn't know how he knew, but he knew, or he'd made an inference close enough to correct that the distinction didn't matter. "He called to follow up on the gala," she said, which was true. "And he asked you to dinner." She went very still. Robert's face didn't change. "His assistant called our main line this morning. Apparently Moretti's office wanted to confirm that any personal communications between him and Sterling Capital staff went through the appropriate professional channels." He paused. His assistant was quite formal about it. The implication was clear. Evelyn's hands were flat on the desk in front of her. She was aware of them in the way you become aware of your hands when you're deciding not to move them. "That has nothing to do with the breach," she said. "No," Robert said. "But it has something to do with your position in this investigation and your access to the Moretti relationship." His voice had shifted, not unkind, but calibrated. The voice of a man who is explaining the shape of a box while standing outside it. "If there's a personal dimension to your interaction with the client, that complicates your role here." She understood what he was doing. She understood it completely, and she felt the cold thing in her chest spread by another degree, and she kept her hands flat on the desk and her voice level, and her face exactly as neutral as it needed to be. "You're removing me from the investigation," she said. "I'm suggesting that given the complexity of the situation—" "Robert." Her voice came out quieter than she expected, quieter and harder. "Someone used my team's server directory to route a leak, and you are using a phone call from a client as a reason to sideline the one person who has already identified the source." I'm not sidelining. Then what are you doing? The office was very quiet. The building had been filling up around them. She could hear it, the elevator sounds, the distant phone rings, the ambient accumulation of a workday beginning. But in this room, right now, it was very quiet. Robert straightened. The decision was visible in his posture before it came out of his mouth. The slight squaring of the shoulders, the organizational resolution that came from someone who had managed 17 crises and had a method. You'll remain involved in the document recovery process, he said, but I'm bringing in an external legal team to oversee the investigation. And until this is resolved, your direct communication with Moretti Global goes through my office. She looked at him. That's not a punitive measure, he said. It's a structural one. I understand, she said. Her voice was perfectly even. Can I ask you something? Of course. The questions you were asking last night, about my unsupervised access to the finalized documents. She looked at him directly. Were those questions you started asking after Diane told you about the breach, or were they questions you were already prepared to ask? Robert Hale held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, I'll have legal contact you by 10, and he picked up the copy of the documents, and he walked out of her office. She sat in the chair that had her name on the door. Metaphorically, her name was not actually on the door. And she looked at the empty door frame, and she breathed. Someone had set this up, the documents, the relay misdirection, the scheduling, all of it arranged with enough advance preparation that it couldn't have been improvised. Whoever did this had been planning it for weeks. And now Robert Hale was running interference on the investigation with an efficiency that did not feel like the efficiency of a man who had just learned about a problem. She opened her laptop, went back to the list of 7 names she'd started building at 2 in the morning. She looked at Marcus Chen's name. She thought about his account being used. She thought about whether Marcus was the kind of man who had been planning something for weeks, or whether Marcus was the kind of man whose account got used by someone with the access and the motivation to make it look that way. Then she looked at the name below Marcus's. She had put Robert Hale on the list at 2 in the morning, 4th from the bottom, with a small question mark, because she had been trying to be methodical rather than reactive, and methodology required including everyone with access. She removed the question mark. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Different from last night's. She answered because she was past the point of being selective about incoming information. Ms. Carter. Not Vincent this time. A woman's voice, precise, cool, efficient. My name is Angela Reeves. I'm the Chief of Staff for Moretti Global Holdings. Mr. Moretti asked me to reach out to you directly. Evelyn gripped the phone. All right. Mr. Moretti would like to meet with you today, not at Sterling Capital, not at our offices. A pause. He is available at noon at Gramercy Park. He suggested you would know why. She did know why, or she could construct why. If Vincent's office had called Sterling Capital's main line this morning about communications protocols, then Vincent already knew something was wrong. He hadn't risen to his position by being slow to recognize when the ground was shifting under a negotiation. Tell him noon works, she said. He also asked me to tell you, Angela Reeves said, and her voice carried something that was almost, not quite warmth, that this is not the dinner he proposed. Evelyn looked at her office, at the documents on her desk, at the empty door frame where Robert Hale had been standing 5 minutes ago. I understood that, she said. She hung up and sat for a moment. Then she started moving. Not frantically, efficiently. She needed copies. She needed the IT log she'd printed this morning. She needed the document version history that she had access to this morning and might not have access to by afternoon if Robert's structural measures moved faster than she expected. She needed everything she had found before someone changed what was findable. She had 4 hours. She printed. She copied. She compiled methodically, the kind of methodical that had kept her employed for 4 years and had saved 3 separate negotiations from collapsing and had apparently earned the attention of a man who read routing notes and paid attention to names. At 9:45, she was almost done. At 9:46, Marcus Chen walked into her office. He was wearing the gray suit he wore on important days. She knew this because she had been paying attention for 4 years, the way she paid attention to everything, and Marcus wore the gray suit when he knew the stakes were elevated. His face was the face of a man who had not slept and who had been preparing something to say. You know, he said. Not a question. She looked at him. Close the door, Marcus. He closed it. He sat down across from her, the chair Robert had not sat in. He put his hands on his knees and he looked at her with the face of someone who has decided that the performance is over. It wasn't supposed to go like this, he said. She felt something cold run through her from the base of her skull to the bottom of her spine. She kept her face exactly where it was. Tell me what it was supposed to go like. He exhaled. It was a long exhale, the kind that a person produces when they've been holding something for a long time. They came to me 4 months ago. Halverson. Who specifically? A man named Garrett Wells. He runs their acquisition development side. Marcus's hands pressed harder against his knees. He told me they knew about the Moretti global deal. Not specifics, just that Sterling was close to closing something major. He said if I could get him the framework terms, he could make sure I was positioned when the dust settled. Positioned how? They offered me a role, director level, with a signing bonus that would... He stopped. That would cover what I needed to cover. She looked at him. She was doing the math. The Tuesdays, the access requests, the consolidation request 3 weeks ago. 4 months of preparation. The scheduled send, she said. You set that up yourself. I didn't know it would go out when it did. I set it for a future date and then... He pressed his fingers against his mouth briefly. Wells moved it. He had someone who could access the system after I gave him my login credentials to demonstrate the access was real. I didn't know he'd use them to actually send it. She sat with that for 3 seconds. It had the texture of something that might be true, and it also had the texture of something that had been prepared to sound like it might be true. And she was not certain which one it was, and she was not going to be certain based on this conversation alone. Marcus, she said, did you know they were going to route it through my directory? The silence lasted too long. Marcus. Wells said it needed to look like it came from the core negotiation team, he said. He said your access level was that it would route more cleanly from your side. He looked at her. I told him it would land on you, and he said it wouldn't matter because by the time anyone investigated, the deal would be off the table. The deal would be off the table. Not just compromised. Off the table entirely, which meant someone at Halverson had a plan for the 41 pages that went beyond reading them. Someone was planning to use the material to disrupt the closing, to go directly to the parties involved and demonstrate that Sterling Capital's internal security was untenable, to make the whole deal, 8 months of work, 147 documents, every routing note and risk assessment and proprietary methodology, collapse. And the person positioned at the center of that collapse, the person whose server directory had been used, the person who had been having private phone conversations with the client and who had now been administratively sidelined by her managing director, was Evelyn Carter. She stood up. Marcus looked up at her. Evelyn, Stop, she said, not loudly. I need you to go back to your office, Marcus. I need you to not delete anything, not contact anyone, and not talk to Robert Hale until I've spoken to legal. She picked up the document copies. Can you do that? What are you going to do? He said. She looked at him. He looked like what he was, a man who had made a catastrophic decision for reasons that were probably not entirely without humanity, and who was now sitting in the wreckage of it, and who was frightened. She felt something that was almost pity, and she put it somewhere she'd deal with later because there was no room for it right now. I'm going to fix this, she said, or I'm going to try. She picked up her coat. She picked up her bag with the copies and the logs and the document history. She looked at her office, the desk, the chair, the good morning light she'd chosen this place partly for, and she thought about what Robert Hale had said about structural measures, and she thought about what Diane had said about her name being the one people would look at first. She had 4 hours before noon. She had 41 pages of stolen material in the hands of a competitor. She had a managing director who was either protecting the firm or protecting himself, and she didn't have time yet to determine which. And she had a meeting at Gramercy Park with a man who ran an empire built on knowing exactly how much information was enough, and exactly when to act on it, and who had been paying attention to her name in routing notes for 14 months. She walked out of her office. The corridor was full now, the workday in full operation, phones ringing, the smell of coffee from the break room, people moving with the purposeful morning energy of a financial firm that did not yet know what was burning inside it. She walked through all of it without stopping, and the elevator doors closed behind her, and for the 11 seconds of the elevator descent she stood completely still and let herself feel the full weight of what she was carrying. Then the doors opened, and she walked out into the lobby, and out through the glass doors, and into the cold New York morning. She had 4 hours. She started moving. The cold hit her the moment she cleared those lobby doors. Not the ambient cold of a November morning, the specific cold of a city that had kept moving while everything inside her building had been coming apart at the seams. She stood on the sidewalk for exactly 2 seconds, getting her bearings, and then she started walking. Not toward the subway, not toward a cab. She needed to move under her own power for a few blocks before she made any decisions, because her body was doing something she recognized as the early stages of shock. Not the medical kind, the psychological kind, the kind that came from having the floor drop out from under you in slow increments over the course of one night and one morning. She walked 4 blocks north. The bag was heavy on her shoulder, documents, logs, the compiled history of 8 months of work that someone had spent 4 months figuring out how to destroy. She kept her pace easy. She let the city do its thing around her. The delivery trucks, the school crossing guard on the corner of 34th, the woman in the enormous parka walking 3 small dogs who wanted to go 3 different directions. She stopped at a coffee cart on the corner of 36th, bought something she didn't taste, and stood there for a moment with the cup in both hands, letting the heat come through. She had 4 hours. She had 4 hours and she had 41 pages of stolen documents, and she had a managing director who had removed her from the investigation with the precision of someone who knew where the edges of the situation were. And she had Marcus Chen sitting in his office with a gray suit and a confession and the particular expression of a man who had understood too late what he'd been used for. She had 4 hours. She started moving again. She called Diane from the sidewalk. Because Diane was the only person inside Sterling Capital she was still operating on the assumption of, and she understood that even that assumption was carrying more weight than it had this time yesterday. Diane answered on the first ring. "Where are you?" "Outside, walking." Evelyn switched the coffee to her left hand. "Robert moved me off the investigation." A pause. "When?" 8:30. "External legal team," he said. "My communications with Moretti Global go through his office." She paused at a crosswalk. "Has the external team been brought in yet?" "I got an email 40 minutes ago. Farrow and Glass." Evelyn knew Farrow and Glass. They were excellent, which was not the problem. The problem was that they were thorough and methodical and would need days to establish the operational picture that Evelyn had already established in 3 hours, days that she did not have. "Who's the lead partner?" "Sandra Chu." "Good." She crossed the street. "Call Sandra Chu and tell her that the preliminary trace findings already identify a specific account. Tell her the IT logs exist and are compiled and that she should request them from IT directly and not through Robert's office." Evelyn, "I'm not asking you to go around Robert," she said. "I'm asking you to make sure the lead investigator has access to the evidence. That's your job." A breath on the other end. "All right. One more thing." She stepped around a scaffolding gap in the sidewalk. "Garrett Wells at Halverson. I need everything we have on him. Any interaction, any prior approach, any documentation of the 3 intermediary contacts over the past 18 months. That's in the business development files. I can pull it. Send it to my personal email, not my Sterling account." The pause this time was different, longer, heavier with what it was understanding. "Evelyn, if Robert sees you working the investigation from outside, then he sees it," she said. "Send it." She hung up. The coffee was better now that it had been in her hand long enough to cool to a temperature that actually worked in the cold. She drank it, and she walked, and she did the thing she did when a problem was large enough to require architecture rather than instinct. She broke it into its components and arranged them in order of what could actually be acted on. The leak had happened. That was fixed in the past. She couldn't unleak the documents. Halverson had the documents. If they acted on them, if they approached Moretti Global directly, if they presented the material as evidence of Sterling's internal failure, the deal died. She had maybe 48 hours before that became the active situation, possibly less. People like Garrett Wells didn't sit on leverage. Marcus had the full Halverson contact history in his account. If she could get that information to Farrow and Glass before Robert understood what she was doing, there was a path. But none of that was the real problem. The real problem was that Vincent Moretti had called Sterling Capital's main line this morning, which meant he already knew something was wrong. A man in his position didn't call to confirm communications protocols. unless he had already received information that made him want to understand where the communications were coming from. He was already moving. The question was in which direction. She had noon at Gramercy Park to answer that question before he moved somewhere she couldn't reach him. She flagged a cab at 38th and got in and gave the address of her apartment. She needed 30 minutes, a change of clothes, and the hard copy of the document version history she'd printed and left on her kitchen table at 3 in the morning when she'd finally stopped reading. She was back out by 10:25. Different clothes, charcoal, structured. The jacket she wore when she needed to be taken seriously in rooms where being taken seriously required visible information. Her hair was up. She had eaten something she couldn't remember eating. The bag on her shoulder had more in it now. The version history, the IT logs, the compiled 14 months of routing notes, and a thumb drive she'd copied everything onto because she had learned in 4 years that paper was good and redundancy was better. She had her phone in her hand and she was reading the files Diane had sent to her personal account while walking the 2 blocks to the next cab she flagged. The Halverson information was thin. 3 intermediary approaches documented in business development, all declined, all routed through Sterling's corporate response process. The name Garrett Wells appeared once, in a footnote, as the apparent originator of the second approach. Thin. But it existed, which meant there was a paper trail, and paper trails were Evelyn's native ecosystem. She had her phone against her ear before she'd consciously decided to make the call. It rang twice. "Miss Carter," Vincent's voice. Present, unhurried, carrying the quality that she had noticed 14 months ago and never quite stopped noticing. The quality of someone who had already anticipated several versions of the next 10 minutes. "I need to talk to you before noon," she said. A brief pause. "All right." "Not at Gramercy Park. I need somewhere I can put documents on a table." Another pause. She heard him say something to someone else. Low, brief, in the tone of an instruction being given. Then, "There's a hotel on Park Avenue called the Whitmore, 17 floors. There's a private meeting room on the 3rd floor reserved under a different name. The lobby staff knows me." He paused. "Can you be there in 30 minutes?" "Yes. I'll have coffee that's actually hot this time," he said, and hung up. She got in the cab and gave the address and sat back and breathed. What? The Whitmore was old money in the specific New York sense. Dark wood paneling, staff who moved quietly, the ambient hush of a building that had decided decades ago that discretion was its primary amenity. The lobby staff did know him, in the way that people know a name when it has been associated with a room reliably enough to become a standing arrangement. The meeting room on the 3rd floor was small, oval-tabled, with a window that looked onto Park Avenue at an angle that caught the morning light. Coffee on a sideboard. Hot, she could tell from across the room. 2 cups. He had already been there. Vincent was standing when she came in, jacket on, and he looked at her with the expression she was learning to read. The one that looked like stillness, but was actually intake. Information being assembled, weighted, filed. She put the bag on the table. She didn't sit. "How much do you know?" she said. He didn't pretend to misunderstand the question. "Someone at Halverson Meridian Group reached out to one of my industry contacts last night. My contact called me at 6 this morning. He had been offered a preliminary look at what he was told were Sterling Capital's internal framework terms for our infrastructure deal." His voice was flat and precise. "He sent me what they showed him." She pulled out the document copy, set it on the table, slid it toward him. He looked at it without picking it up. Then he looked at her. "You already know what this is." "I identified the breach at 11:30 last night," she said. "I've been tracing it since 6:40 this morning. I have the IT logs, the account trail, and a conversation with the source." His eyes moved to her face with a focus that was physical in its intensity. "Who?" "I'm not ready to tell you that yet," she said, "because the source was used, which means there's a second actor who's more important right now." She pulled out the Halverson documentation. "Garrett Wells, Halverson's acquisition development lead. He's had a direct line into your deal for 4 months." She watched him absorb that. He was very still when he processed things. She'd noticed it across 7 meetings, the way other people filled silence with movement or sound, and Vincent did the opposite, becoming more contained as the stakes went up. "Sit down," he said. Not unkindly, just as a practical observation about the duration of what was coming. She sat. He sat. The coffee was there and she poured it because her hands needed something to do. "Walk me through what you have," he said. She walked him through it. She laid it out in order: the timeline, the access records, the scheduled send, the relay misdirection, the Halverson approach 4 months prior, Marcus Chen's account, the conversation she'd had at 8:15 in her office. She did not editorialize. She presented the architecture the way she would have presented any contract analysis: structure first, implication second, conclusion only when the evidence supported it. He did not interrupt once. When she finished, the coffee was half gone, and the documents were arranged across the oval table in the sequence she'd built them, and the morning light on Park Avenue had moved by about 30 degrees. Vincent sat with the whole thing for a moment. His hands were flat on the table, not quite touching the documents, and his jaw was the jaw of a man who had metabolized this information at speed and was now located somewhere several steps ahead of it. "They're going to use it to approach me directly," he said. "Yes. I think within 48 hours. They'll present it as a demonstration that Sterling Capital's internal security is untenable and position themselves as the alternative partner. They'll frame it as doing you a favor, while holding stolen material they paid someone to steal." His voice was level, but there was something underneath it. Not anger exactly, something more controlled than anger. The thing that lives beneath anger in people who have learned to keep it there. "What does your managing director know?" She took a breath. "He knows about the breach. He's brought in an external legal team." A pause. "He removed me from the investigation this morning." Vincent's eyes came to her face. "Why?" "He said my personal communication with you complicated my role." She kept her voice even. "But he knew about your call before I told him, and he was asking questions about my access to the documents before the investigation was formally underway." She looked at him directly. "I put his name on the list at 2 in the morning. I removed the question mark at 8:30. The silence in the room was the kind that has weight. "You think your managing director is involved," Vincent said. "I think he knew about the investigation before it was told to him," she said. "I think his structural measures this morning were damage control, not crisis management. And I think the fact that he moved to sideline me, specifically me, the person who had already identified the source, within 45 minutes of learning I'd been working the trace." She stopped. "I think that's not a coincidence." Vincent looked at her for a long moment. "If you're right," he said, "then Robert Hale was not acting alone. Halverson would need an internal Sterling contact with enough standing to guarantee the material's authenticity. Someone who could confirm to Wells that what he was buying was real and complete." "Yes," she said. "And if Hale is that contact," Vincent said, "then the external legal team he's brought in is another form of containment," she said. "Not investigation." The room was very quiet. The Park Avenue traffic was entirely separate from what was happening in here. She became aware, in the specific way that you become aware of things when the stakes cross a certain threshold, of the sound of her own breathing and the temperature of the room and the way Vincent Moretti was sitting across from her with the stillness of someone who was deciding something. "What do you want to do?" he said. The question landed differently than she expected. Not "what should we do?" "What do you want to do?" The subject was her. She looked at the documents on the table. She looked at the window. She looked at the man across from her who had read routing notes for 14 months and who had inserted himself into a humiliating public moment without being asked, and who was now sitting in a hotel meeting room asking her what she wanted. "I want to close the deal," she said. "That's what I want. 8 months of work, and the deal is valid, and the terms are good, and the only thing wrong with it is that someone decided to use it as a mechanism." And Hale. "I want the evidence to go to the right people," she said. "Not Farrow and Glass if they're Hale's containment team. Somewhere else. Somewhere that can move fast enough to intercept Halverson before Wells makes his approach to you." "And Marcus Chen," she breathed. "Marcus was used. I believe that. What he did was still a breach of every obligation he had, and I'm not going to minimize it. But he was the instrument, not the architect." She looked at Vincent. "The architect is the person I want." Vincent nodded. One nod, slow, the kind that wasn't agreement or disagreement, but recognition. "I have people," he said, "outside the legal and financial infrastructure. People who are very good at understanding the architecture of a situation and moving through it without leaving unnecessary marks." She looked at him. She understood what he was saying, and she understood what it meant that he was saying it, and she understood that this was the moment where the line between his legitimate empire and what his legitimate empire was built on top of became permeable in a way that she had always known was possible and had never directly encountered before. "I'm not asking you to do anything outside the law," she said carefully. "I know that," he said. "Neither am I." A pause. "But I do have a former federal prosecutor on retainer who has a 12-year working relationship with the SEC's Enforcement Division. And I have a forensic accounting firm that can build an evidentiary package overnight that would make Farrow and Glass's timeline look geological." He looked at her steadily. "Those are legal resources. They're simply faster than what Sterling Capital is going to deploy, and they don't answer to Robert Hale." She sat with that for a moment. "Why?" she said. "Why what? Why are you offering this?" She kept her voice level. "This is your deal at risk. Your interest in containing the breach is obvious, but what you're describing goes beyond containing the breach." She looked at him. "You're offering to help me." He held her gaze. Something moved through his expression, not the controlled executive neutrality she was accustomed to from him, but something that was underneath that, something more direct. "Because the person who designed this," he said, "designed it specifically to put your name in the center of it. They used your directory, your team's access, your professional relationship with me. If this plays out the way it's been staged, you lose your position, the investigation closes without finding Hale, Wells completes his approach to me, and the deal dies." He paused. "And you're left carrying the weight of a breach you spent the night trying to prevent." She felt something in her chest that was not comfortable and that she didn't push away. "That's a reason to help the investigation," she said. "Not specifically me." "The investigation," he said, "is the same thing as you, in this case." He picked up his coffee, drank, set it down with the precise economy of his movements. "Also, I called you last night because I wanted to have dinner with you, and it would be very inconvenient if you were wrongfully terminated before that happened." The sentence was so unexpected that she almost, not quite, laughed. The same almost as the night before, the same edge of it. "You're serious," she said. "I'm always serious," he said. "That's one of my less charming qualities." They worked for 2 hours at the oval table. It was the kind of working that she was good at and that she discovered, with something that felt like recognition, Vincent was also good at. Not the same kind of good. He operated at the level of strategic architecture, the large frame picture, who needed to know what and in what order. She operated at the document level, the specific evidence, the chain of custody. But the two kinds of good fit together in the way of things that have been built for complementary purposes without anyone planning it that way. His former prosecutor, a woman named Eleanor Marsh, who answered on the second ring and spoke in the clipped declarative sentences of someone who had spent 12 years in federal court, listened to the evidence summary in 20 minutes and came back with a framework in 10. She needed the IT logs, the account access records, the Halverson approach documentation, and 48 hours. Evelyn sent everything from her personal email. Eleanor Marsh called back 4 minutes later to confirm receipt and to ask 2 questions about the routing relay that Evelyn answered in terms that made Eleanor say, "Good, I can work with this." At 11:58, Vincent's phone rang. He looked at the screen, looked at Evelyn, and answered. She could hear the other voice, not clearly, but enough. It was brief. It was professional. When Vincent hung up, his expression had not changed, but something in the set of his shoulders had shifted by a degree. "Wells called my office," he said. "He's requested an urgent meeting. He says he has material relevant to my current negotiations that I should review before proceeding." There it was. Not 48 hours, less than 12. She felt the cold thing in her chest again, the deep, quiet cold that wasn't panic. She felt it, and she kept her face exactly where it was. "He moved faster than I expected," she said. "He's good at what he does," Vincent said, "which is the only generous thing I'll say about him." "Are you going to take the meeting?" He looked at her for a moment. "What would you advise?" She thought. She thought about the 41 pages in Eleanor Marsh and 48 hours that had just compressed into something considerably shorter. She thought about Brandon Hayes standing in a ballroom constructing a sentence designed to diminish her while the room watched. She thought about Robert Hale's face at 8:30 this morning, saying the word structural with the precision of a man who had already loaded it. "Take the meeting," she said. "Don't tell him you know the material is stolen. Let him make his presentation. Record everything. Everything he says, every claim he makes about the source of the information." She leaned forward slightly. Once he makes those claims on record, Eleanor Marsh has a criminal case that doesn't need the IT logs. He will have incriminated himself by possession and use of stolen proprietary material. Vincent looked at her for a long moment. "When did you learn to do this?" he said. "Do what?" "Think 3 moves ahead while the room is on fire." She picked up her coffee. It was cold now, but she drank it anyway. "I've been putting out other people's fires for 4 years," she said. "Eventually you learn the geometry of them." He almost smiled. Not quite, but the edge of it. She left the Whitmore at 12:40. She stood on Park Avenue with her bag on her shoulder and the thumb drive in her jacket pocket and her phone in her hand, and she understood that the next 24 hours were going to determine whether 8 months of work survived, and whether her position at Sterling Capital survived, and whether Robert Hale's version of events became the official record, or something else did. She called Eleanor Marsh directly. Eleanor answered on the first ring. "The timeline moved," Evelyn said. "Wells is approaching Moretti today." A pause. Then the clipped declarative voice. "Can Moretti get me a recording?" "Yes." "Then the timeline moved in our favor," Eleanor said. "I'll have the criminal referral ready to go the moment I have that recording in hand. SEC enforcement and DOJ, Wells and whoever engaged him have a problem they are not currently aware of." "There's also a Sterling Capital executive involved," Evelyn said, "managing director level." Silence. "The professional kind, not the uncomfortable kind." "Send me everything you have on him." "It's circumstantial at this point." "Send it anyway," Eleanor said. "Circumstantial is how it starts." Evelyn hung up. She stood on the sidewalk with the cold New York air doing its thing, and she let herself feel, for exactly 30 seconds, which was all she could afford, the full scope of what was happening, the exposure of it, the specific vulnerability of being the person who had built something carefully for a long time, and had then watched someone decide to use that thing as the mechanism of their own destruction. 30 seconds. Then she straightened and she started moving. She had one more call to make. She did not want to make it. She made it anyway. Marcus picked up on the third ring. "Evelyn." His voice was the voice of a man who had been sitting in his office for 3 hours doing the arithmetic of his own choices. "Listen carefully," she said. "I need the complete contact record between you and Garrett Wells. Every communication, email, phone, text, in-person meeting notes, anything that documents the 4-month engagement." She paused. "I know you have it because you're methodical, Marcus. You document everything. It's one of the things that made you good at this job." A long silence. If you give me that," she said, "Eleanor Marsh can build a case where you were the victim of a sophisticated fraud operation, which is partially true. If you don't give me that, the only thing the investigation will have is your account used as the delivery mechanism, and that story ends with you and not with Wells or Hale." Another silence, longer. She heard him breathing. "Hale," he said, finally, the name coming out like something released under pressure. Hale made the introduction. He said Wells was a legitimate business development contact. His voice was getting tighter. "I didn't know. At the start, I didn't know what they actually wanted. When I understood what they were building," he stopped. "I was already in it." Something moved through her that wasn't quite vindication and wasn't quite sorrow. "Send everything to my personal email," she said. "Not your Sterling account. Right now, Marcus. Not in an hour." "Okay," he said quietly. She hung up. She kept walking. The city kept being the city. Indifferent, enormous, moving at its own speed with its own purposes, entirely unconcerned with the specific human machinery grinding itself apart on its sidewalks. Her phone buzzed. "Eleanor Marsh," she answered. "The recording from Moretti's meeting with Wells." Eleanor's voice was very precise. "When Wells makes his presentation, I need Moretti to ask one specific question. He needs to ask Wells to confirm the source of the material, not suggest it. Ask directly. Make Wells state it on record." "I'll tell him," Evelyn said. "One more thing." A pause. "When this breaks, and it will break, because these things always break, there's going to be a question about Moretti Global's position on continuing with Sterling Capital." Another pause. "That's not my question to answer, but it's coming." Evelyn knew it was coming. She had known it was coming since 11:30 last night, in the back of a cab reading documents that described the deliberate destruction of something she had built. I know, she said. She had known for a while that this was where the road was leading, that at some point the question of whether the deal survived was going to be inseparable from the question of what Sterling Capital looked like on the other side of this. Who was still standing, who had been removed, what the institutional architecture of the firm looked like when the investigation finished. She had one more move. She found a bench on the edge of Madison Square Park, and she sat down. The park was doing its midday thing, dog walkers, people eating lunch on benches, a kid on a scooter being navigated by a nanny. All of it proceeding entirely without reference to what was happening in Evelyn Carter's chest. She opened her laptop. She accessed her Sterling Capital account, which she still had because Robert's structural measures hadn't moved that fast yet. She opened the contract development files. She found the Moretti Global Infrastructure Framework, the real one, the complete version, all 63 pages, the payment structure and the liability clauses, and the timeline benchmarks and the 2 proprietary risk assessment methodologies. She opened a new document, and she began to write. Not a memo, not a brief. A proposal, clean, specific, structured in the way that things needed to be structured when they needed to survive a transition. A proposal for how the Moretti Global Infrastructure deal could proceed with a modified Sterling Capital negotiation team, with new security protocols, with documented oversight structures that addressed every vulnerability that had been exploited in the past 4 months. She wrote for an hour. The park moved around her. The laptop screen was slightly too bright in the midday light, but she didn't stop. When she finished, she had 14 pages. 14 pages that assumed the deal was still alive, and that made a specific argument for why it should stay alive, and that laid out, in the precise documented language she had learned to use, exactly how you rebuild a structure after someone has spent 4 months trying to burn it from the inside. She read it twice. Then she sent it to Vincent Moretti's personal email, the one his assistant had included in the meeting confirmation that morning, with a subject line that said simply, "For the question that's coming." She sat on the bench. She waited. Her phone buzzed 4 minutes later. "Vincent, I'm in the meeting with Wells now." Then, 60 seconds later, "He's presenting the material." Then, 3 minutes of silence that felt geological. Then, he confirmed the source. Sterling Capital Internal. Named Hale as the guarantor of authenticity. She closed her eyes. 1 second. 2. Opened them. She typed, "Eleanor Marsh needs that recording in the next 30 minutes. His reply came back in 8 seconds. "It's already uploading." She sat on the bench in Madison Square Park with her laptop in her bag and the document history of 8 months of work, and she breathed. In another building across the city, Garrett Wells was sitting in a meeting room where a man who had spent his life learning how much information was enough had just let him finish speaking and was now looking at him with an expression that Evelyn had never personally been on the wrong side of, but could construct precisely from 14 months of watching him work. In the Sterling Capital offices on 7th Avenue, Robert Hale was managing a crisis he believed he had contained. In a hotel on Park Avenue, Eleanor Marsh was on the phone with the SEC. And on a bench in Madison Square Park, Evelyn Carter was looking at 14 pages she had written in 1 hour and thinking about what it cost to build something carefully for a long time, and what it cost more to refuse to let someone else decide when it ended. Her phone rang. She looked at the screen. "Eleanor Marsh," she answered. "The recording is sufficient," Eleanor said. "I've already made the call. DOJ and SEC are moving tonight." A pause. The professional kind. "There's a second issue." "Hale," Evelyn said. "The circumstantial material you sent combined with Wells naming him as guarantor of authenticity. That's no longer circumstantial." Eleanor's voice carried the specific flatness of someone delivering information they have stripped of all emotional content because the content is heavy enough without it. "Robert Hale is going to have a very difficult evening." Evelyn sat with that. "One more thing," Eleanor said. "I spoke with Moretti before the Wells meeting. He read your proposal." She hadn't expected that. She kept her voice steady. "And?" "He said to tell you," Eleanor said, "that the question you anticipated is the right question, and that the 14 pages answer it better than anything his own team would have written." A pause. "He also said, and I'm quoting exactly because I believe he intended it to be quoted, 'Tell her the deal isn't what I'm most interested in preserving.'" The park was bright and cold and entirely itself, and Evelyn sat in the middle of it with her hand tight around the phone. "Thank you, Ms. Marsh," she said. She hung up. She sat very still for a moment. Then she stood, picked up her bag, closed her laptop, and looked out at the park, the dog walkers, and the scooter kid, and the lunch on a bench people. And she felt the weight of the last 20 hours settle into something that wasn't resolution yet, but was the shape of resolution, the outline of it, the moment just before the thing becomes what it was always going to be. Her phone buzzed one more time. Vincent. No preamble. Where are you? She looked at the message, looked at the park, looked at the city going about its irreducible business beyond the tree line. She typed, Madison Square Park, south entrance. His reply was immediate. Stay there. She put the phone in her pocket. She stood at the south entrance of Madison Square Park with the cold November air and the city noise, and her bag full of documents that were about to become evidence. And she waited, because she had done everything she could do, and now the next part required something other than documentation and analysis and 3 moves ahead thinking. It required the specific patience of someone who had learned, not easily, not without cost, that the right things sometimes came to you when you stopped running toward them and simply held your ground. She heard footsteps on the path. She turned. Vincent was coming through the park entrance, jacket on, moving with the unhurried, purposeful stride of a man who had always known that being slow and deliberate was not the same thing as being late, and he was looking at her with an expression that was not his executive face or his negotiation face or the carefully managed neutrality she had catalogued across 14 months, and she understood suddenly that she was looking at the version of him that almost nobody got. He stopped in front of her, close enough that the ambient cold between them was less than it had been. Wells is in federal custody, he said. Eleanor Marsh is efficient. I know, she said. Hale's office has 2 SEC representatives in it. He looked at her steadily. It's done. She breathed, in and out. The cold air had an edge to it. The deal, she said. The deal is fine, he said. The deal was always going to be fine. He looked at her with the directness she had stopped being surprised by and had started simply receiving. The question is what happens to your position at Sterling Capital when this finishes playing out. I don't know yet, she said honestly. I do, he said. She looked at him. My legal team is filing a request tomorrow, he said. A formal request to Sterling Capital's board, not to Hale's office, requesting that the primary negotiation contact for the Moretti Global account be maintained at its current personnel level for the duration of the closing period and beyond. He paused. That request is going to be very difficult for Sterling's board to decline, given the circumstances. She stared at him. You're using your position to protect my job. I'm using my position as a client to make a formal request that the person who actually does the work remains employed, he said, which is a thing clients are allowed to do. Something moved in his expression. I told you 14 months ago. I read the routing notes. I know whose name is on the work. She stood in the park with the cold and the city and this man and the weight of 20 hours and everything she had built and protected and refused to let go of, and she felt something give way inside her. Not collapse, not break, just give way, the way a breath does when you've been holding it long enough that releasing it changes something in the body. You should know, she said, and her voice was steadier than she expected, that I'm not someone who needs to be protected. I know that, he said. I'm not protecting you. A pause. I'm making sure the right person is in the right place when the smoke clears. There's a difference. She looked at him for a long moment. I read the proposal, he said. Eleanor told me. The section on the modified oversight structure, he said. The one that rebuilds the security framework from the document level. Who designed that? I did. In how long? An hour, she said. In the park. He looked at her with an expression that had something in it she recognized from no prior professional context and recognized from every human one. Have dinner with me, he said. Not now. When this is finished. When the closing is done and the investigation is resolved and you've had whatever time you need to not be in the middle of a crisis. That could be weeks, she said. I know. You're willing to wait weeks. I've been reading your routing notes for 14 months, he said. Weeks is nothing. The park was bright and cold and the city was its irreducible self. And Brandon Hayes was somewhere in it. in the building that had the right zip code and the borrowed confidence of a man who had always been very good at performing certainty, and none of that mattered anymore in the way it had mattered last night under the chandeliers. She looked at Vincent Moretti in the flat November light. "All right," she said. He nodded. Once the slow nod of recognition. Good. And then, because he was who he was, and because he had never once in 14 months been interested in performing for an audience when there wasn't one, he reached out and briefly, with the economy of someone who understood that the gesture needed to be small enough to be real, put his hand over hers. Just for a moment. The warmth of it specific against the cold. Then he dropped it, and he stood there with his hands in his pockets, and he looked at the park the way she'd been looking at it, and she stood beside him. And they were two people who had just prevented something catastrophic, and they were standing in the ordinary November city, and the extraordinary part was how ordinary it felt. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. Diane. Board has been notified. Emergency meeting called. Robert is on administrative leave pending investigation. She showed the screen to Vincent without comment. He read it, looked up. His expression was exactly what she expected. Not satisfaction, not triumph. Something colder than either and more durable. The expression of a man who had understood from the beginning where this was going and had waited for the architecture to become visible to everyone else. "Go," he said. "You have work to finish." She picked up her bag. She looked at him one more time. The park, the light. The man who had read her name in routing notes and remembered it. 14 months, she said. 14 months, he agreed. She turned and walked out of the park, and the city received her back into itself, and she moved through it toward the next thing with the specific quality of someone who had been through the fire and found that what was on the other side of it was not what they'd expected, and was better, and was entirely their own. The Sterling Capital Board met at 4 o'clock. Not in the main conference room. That room had windows that faced the street, and someone had made the calculation that windows facing the street were inadvisable when 2 SEC representatives were already in the building, and the financial press had a well-documented ability to read lip movements through glass. They used the interior conference room on the 12th floor instead, the one without windows, the one that smelled like recycled air and old decisions. Evelyn was not in that room. She was in her office on the 7th floor, at her desk, with the door open, working. Not performing work. Actually working. Because the Moretti Global closing documentation still needed to be restructured to account for the new oversight protocols she'd outlined in the 14-page proposal, and that restructuring was going to take the better part of 3 days, regardless of what happened above her on the 12th floor, and she had learned a long time ago that the most useful thing you could do while waiting for a large institution to make a decision about your fate was to make yourself indispensable in the meantime. Diane came by at 4:20. She stood in the door frame without coming in, which was how Diane communicated that something was happening but hadn't finished happening yet. "They're still in there," Diane said. "I know," Evelyn said, without looking up from the document. "Sandra Chu from Farrow and Glass is up there too. She apparently had a conversation with Eleanor Marsh this afternoon that recalibrated her understanding of the situation considerably." "Good," Evelyn said. A pause. "How are you doing?" Diane said. Not the professional inquiry, the other one. Evelyn looked up. Diane was standing in the doorframe with the expression of a woman who had been in legal for 11 years and had learned that the professional and the personal were not as separate as the org chart implied. She looked tired. She also looked like she'd been on Evelyn's side since 11:30 last night and was not planning to stop. "I'm fine," Evelyn said, and then, because Diane deserved better than the automatic answer, "I'm exhausted, but I'm fine." Diane nodded. Marcus submitted his full communication record to Sandra Chu's team at 2 o'clock. Everything. The Wells contacts, the Halverson approach documentation, the meeting notes. She paused. He also submitted a written account of Robert's introduction. "I know," Evelyn said. "He copied me." Diane looked at her. "He copied you?" "He wanted me to know he'd followed through," she said. "I think it was the closest he could get to an apology." Diane absorbed that. "What happens to him?" "That's not my decision," Evelyn said. "But he cooperated fully, and the cooperation matters, and Eleanor's team has already noted it in the criminal referral." She looked back at her document. "What happens to him is going to be determined by people with more authority over that question than either of us." Diane stayed in the doorframe for another moment. "You should know," she said, That 3 people on the board know you identified the breach independently, overnight, while Robert was already managing the cover story, Sandra Chu told them. A pause. I don't know if that changes anything. It might not, Evelyn said. No, Diane agreed. It might not. She straightened. I'll come back when there's something to come back for. She left. Evelyn went back to the document. She worked for another hour and 40 minutes. At 6:07, her phone buzzed. Internal extension, the board's executive assistant, a woman named Patricia, who had been at Sterling Capital for longer than most of the partners, and who communicated exclusively in complete sentences and the barest possible inflection. Ms. Carter, the board is ready to see you. The interior conference room on the 12th floor had 6 people in it when she arrived. 3 board members, she knew all of them by name and professional history, had briefed 2 of them personally on the Moretti Global deal at the 8-month mark. Sandra Chu, who looked exactly like someone who had been on the phone with the SEC for 3 hours and had metabolized the experience into a very focused professional energy. An HR director named James Whitfield, who had the expression of a man navigating terrain that had been mapped wrong, and a man she didn't recognize who turned out to be Sterling Capital's general counsel, brought in from what she suspected was a very short-notice call. Robert Hale was not in the room. She noted the absence. She did not comment on it. They offered her a chair. She sat. She put her bag on the floor beside her and her hands on the table in front of her, and she looked at the board with the expression she had been practicing since 6:40 this morning. Not defensive, not combative, just present. The senior board member, Arthur Kesling, 67, the kind of white-haired gravitas that came from 4 decades of being right often enough to stop explaining himself, looked at her for a moment before he spoke. I want to start by saying, he said, that what you did in the past 24 hours is not what we're going to spend this meeting discussing. What you found, and how you found it, and the speed at which you moved, that's going to be in the record, and it's going to matter. But the board has several questions, and I want to get through them. Of course, she said, your communication with Vincent Moretti. He kept his voice neutral. This was the voice of a man conducting a necessary inquiry rather than a prosecution. The personal dimension of it. When did that begin? Last night, she said. After the gala. He called me. The call was initiated by him. And prior to last night. Strictly professional, she said. 7 meetings across 14 months. Standard client interaction, all documented in the Sterling Capital communication files. He asked you to dinner. He did. And you... I told him I needed time to think about it, she said, which is what I told him. Kesling looked at her. He was assessing something. Not whether she was telling the truth, she thought, but whether the truth was the problem he'd been told it was. Robert suggested that the personal dimension compromised your objectivity in the investigation. Robert also named Halverson's guarantor of authenticity to Garrett Wells, she said. She kept her voice level. Which is in the criminal referral documentation that Sandra Chu's team has had since this afternoon. The room was quiet for a moment. Sandra Chu looked at the table with the expression of someone confirming an answer they already had. Yes, Kesling said. We're aware of that. He shifted in his chair slightly. Walk me through your decision to take the investigation materials directly to Moretti rather than to the internal team. The internal team had been compromised, she said. Robert moved me off the investigation and brought in Farrow and Glass, whom he had selected. I had already identified the source account, I had Marcus Chen's cooperation, and I had compiled an evidentiary package that needed to reach someone who could act on it faster than a standard legal timeline and who could not be redirected by Robert's authority. She looked at Kesling directly. Vincent Moretti had resources, legal, external, faster, and a direct interest in the deal's survival. Going to him was the fastest path to a legitimate resolution that didn't run through a managing director who was implicated in the breach. The general counsel, whose name was Harrison, leaned forward slightly. You took confidential Sterling Capital documentation to a client. I took Sterling Capital documentation that evidenced a crime to the party most directly harmed by that crime, she said. I can draw the distinction if it's useful. Harrison looked at her with the expression of a lawyer encountering an argument he hadn't fully prepared for. It's a fine line, he said. Yes, she said. It is. I drew it at 11:30 at night with 20 hours of no sleep and my professional reputation in the middle of it, and I drew it as carefully as I could. She kept her voice flat and factual. I stand by where I drew it. Kathleen was looking at her with something she couldn't fully read. She'd been reading rooms for 4 years, and this one was complicated. Not hostile, but not decided. Ms. Carter, he said, I want to ask you something that's not in the official questions. All right? When you identified Robert's name as a potential actor, last night at 2 in the morning, what did you do with that? She thought about the list, the 7 names, the question mark, the moment at 8:30 when the question mark came off. I kept working, she said. I needed evidence, not a conclusion. The conclusion without the evidence would have been exactly what they were trying to do to me. Assign blame without the chain of proof. She looked at him. So I built the chain first. Kathleen sat back in his chair slightly. Something had resolved in his expression, though she couldn't have named what specifically had resolved. We're going to need 3 days, he said, before any decisions are finalized. The investigation is ongoing, the DOJ and SEC have jurisdiction over parts of it, and the board needs time to assess the operational picture. I understand, she said. In the meantime, your access is reinstated. Full access, all systems. He looked at her steadily. The Moretti Global closing is in 14 days. The board's position is that continuity of the negotiation team is essential and that Moretti Global has formally requested it. A slight pause. We received that request from Moretti's office at 3 o'clock this afternoon. She had known it was coming. She had told Vincent to send it. Knowing it was coming did not entirely prepare her for the specific sensation of hearing it confirmed in this room, in this way, by this man. I'll have the restructured documentation ready in 3 days, she said. Kathleen nodded. That's all for now. She picked up her bag. She stood. She looked around the room once. Sandra Chu, Harrison, the HR director, the 2 board members who hadn't spoken, and she understood that what had happened in this room was not a vindication, not yet, and might never be a complete one, because institutions were not built for complete vindications. They were built for managed continuations, and what had been managed here was the continuation of something she had spent 14 months building. She walked out. The corridor was empty. The building had that after-hours quality, lit, present, but depopulated in the specific way of large offices at 6:30 on a Tuesday, when something bad has happened, and most people have gone home to process it somewhere that isn't the scene. She stood in the corridor for a moment. Then she went back to her office, picked up her coat, turned off her desk lamp, and left. The air outside was colder than the morning had been. The city was doing its early evening thing, the shift change from the daytime crowd to the night one, the restaurants starting to fill. The particular energy of New York deciding what version of itself to be for the next several hours. She walked for a while. Not toward anything specific. Just walked, the way she'd been walking this morning, but different now. The morning walk had been metabolizing shock, and this one was metabolizing something she didn't have a clean word for. Not relief. Not triumph. Something quieter and more complicated. The specific feeling of having been through something that cost real things, and finding that you're still there on the other side of it. She walked 15 blocks before she sat down. A bench outside a small park. Not Madison Square, somewhere smaller. A neighborhood pocket of it. With the kind of light that happens in New York in November at 6:50 in the evening, which is orange-gray and very specific and not beautiful in any postcard sense, but real in a way that postcards never quite achieve. She sat. She breathed. She let her bag rest on the ground beside her. She thought about Marcus. She thought about him sitting in his office in the gray suit, the suit he wore on important days, and she thought about the arithmetic of what he had done, the desperation that had made Halverson's offer legible to him, the slow process of becoming complicit in something before you fully understood what the something was, the particular human failure of choosing the path that solved the immediate problem without accounting for the structural cost. She understood it. That was the complicated part. She didn't forgive it. Forgiveness wasn't her assignment here, but she understood the mechanism of it, how you could be a methodical and careful person for 6 years and still find yourself in a situation where your judgment had been compromised by need and by a man named Garrett Wells, who had known exactly which door to knock on. She thought about Robert Hale. That one was harder. Not harder to understand in the abstract. She had spent 4 years watching Robert Hale make decisions. and she had always known that his competence was adjacent to a certain quality of self-interest that most institutions reward and occasionally produce disasters from. But harder in the specific sense, because she had also spent 4 years watching him protect something she cared about, and because the betrayal of it, not of her specifically, but of the work, of the 8 months and the routing notes, and the deal that she had built one careful document at a time, that cost something she was going to be absorbing for a while. She thought about Brandon Hayes. That one was simplest, which was maybe why it surfaced last. She thought about him in the ballroom, the bourbon and the audience, and the sentence delivered with good teeth. She thought about him on the steps outside, the loosened tie, the calculation behind the eyes, and the single word he said when she was already getting in the car. Just her name, nothing attached. She had spent 3 years carrying the weight of how he had made her feel about herself. She had spent those 3 years doing the work of uncarrying it, the slow, patient work of reconstruction that doesn't announce itself and doesn't have a ceremony and mostly happens in ordinary moments. Tuesday mornings, difficult meetings, the discipline of trusting her own judgment, one decision at a time. She was 31 years old, and she was sitting on a bench in the cold in a city that didn't particularly care about her feelings, and she was fine. She was actually fine, not the automatic version. Fine in the specific sense of having been tested at a level that required everything she had and finding that she had it. That was the thing Brandon had never believed she would find. She sat with it for a moment, just that. Then she picked up her bag and she stood up. She called her mother from the sidewalk, not because her mother was equipped to understand the specifics. Her mother was a retired school librarian in Hartford who believed that New York City was an interesting place to visit and a dangerous place to live, and whose framework for Evelyn's career was loving and approximate. But because there were moments when the person you needed was not the person who understood the situation, but the person who understood you, and her mother was that person. And Evelyn had learned in 4 years of being competent in public to not neglect the private arithmetic of who you actually needed. Her mother answered on the third ring. "Evie, you sound tired." "I am tired," she said. "Are you eating?" "Yes," she said. She had eaten something. She couldn't remember what. "Mom, I'm calling because I had a long day and I wanted to hear your voice." A brief pause on the other end. Her mother had the quality that some people had, of understanding more than they asked about. "Okay," she said. "I'm here." They talked for 20 minutes. About nothing in particular, her mother's book group, a problem with the furnace, a neighbor's new dog. Small things, ordinary things, the texture of a life being lived at a comfortable scale. Evelyn walked while they talked, heading in the general direction of home, and she let the conversation be what it was. Not therapy, not debriefing, just the specific comfort of someone who loved you without conditions or professional stakes. When she hung up, she felt steadier in a way that had nothing to do with strategy. She walked the last 12 blocks home. The investigation ran for 19 days. Robert Hale was formally terminated on day 4. The SEC's enforcement division moved quickly, and the DOJ's involvement made the timeline more compressed than standard corporate investigations allowed. What emerged was a picture that was both more and less surprising than Evelyn had expected. Robert had been approached by Halverson Meridian Group 8 months earlier, which meant his involvement predated the deal's final framework, which meant certain decisions he'd made about team structure and document access over the past 8 months took on a different shape in retrospect. He had not been the architect of the plan. That distinction belonged to Garrett Wells, who had been building this approach for over a year, who had identified Sterling Capital's deal with Moretti Global as the target, who had identified Robert Hale as the internal access point, and who had recruited Marcus Chen as the operational link. Wells had constructed the relay misdirection, had moved the scheduled send, and had made the approach to Vincent's office with the confidence of someone who believed the architecture was clean enough to hold. The architecture had been clean. Evelyn had simply been inside it when it needed to be. Garrett Wells was charged on day 6. The recording from Vincent's meeting, Wells's voice, precise and incriminating, naming Robert Hale as the guarantor and confirming the material's internal Sterling Capital origin, was the center of the evidentiary package Eleanor Marsh delivered to DOJ. It held. Wells's attorney made 2 attempts to have it excluded and failed both times. Marcus Chen cooperated fully. The full cooperation, combined with Eleanor's framework argument that he had been the target of a sophisticated fraud operation that exploited his existing access and manufactured his culpability, resulted in an agreement that cost him his position at Sterling Capital and a period of professional probation, but kept him out of criminal proceedings. Evelyn was not involved in that negotiation. She had given what she had to give, and she'd given it at the moment that mattered, and after that it was other people's territory. On day 7, the Sterling Capital Board made a set of decisions that Patricia communicated to Evelyn in the complete sentences and barely present inflection that were her professional signature. Her title was changed, not cosmetically, substantively. Director of Contract Strategy and Negotiation, which was a title that said what the job actually was, and which came with a direct reporting line to the board's executive committee rather than to a managing director. The salary adjustment that accompanied it was significant enough that when Evelyn saw the number, she sat quietly for a moment before responding. She thought about Brandon, on the steps, saying there's still time. She thought about the specific quality of that kind of condescension, the one that gets dressed up as encouragement, that positions your existing life as a waiting room for the real thing. She thought about it, and then she closed the email from Patricia and went back to the Moretti Global closing documentation, which was due in 7 days, and which she was not going to let run late. The closing happened on a Thursday, not the gala event version. No chandeliers, no string quartets, no 300 people performing their best selves under crystal light. The actual closing was 12 people in a conference room on the 15th floor of Sterling Capital, 4 from Sterling's team, and 4 from Moretti Global, and 4 from the respective legal teams, with a set of documents that had been through 14 months of construction and 4 months of someone trying to destroy them, and 19 days of institutional crisis, and were still, underneath all of it, a good deal. Sound terms. Equitable structure. The kind of agreement that worked because the fundamentals were right, not because the room had been decorated. Vincent was there. Of course he was. He signed everything himself. It was a known practice in Moretti Global that the principal signed, that nothing went out under the company's authority that hadn't been reviewed by the man who ran it. She had seen him sign 3 smaller agreements across 14 months. This was different only in scale. He sat across the table from her during the closing, not beside her. Across. The geometry of the room put them there. The Sterling team on one side and the Moretti Global team on the other, which was the standard configuration and made professional sense, and also meant that for 2.5 hours she was looking at him intermittently across a document-covered table while a contract that both of them had spent 14 months on became real. She watched him read. He read everything. She'd known this, but watching it in the context of a room full of people waiting for him to finish was a different experience than knowing it abstractly. He read at a pace that was not slow but was complete, and twice he paused and asked questions that were precise enough that the 2 attorneys on his side exchanged a glance that communicated something in the specific language of lawyers observing a client who actually knows what they've signed. When it was done, the signatures, the exchanges, the formal acknowledgments that the legal team walked them through, there was the particular silence that closing rooms have, the exhale of something long held finally released. Someone on the Sterling side said something about a toast, and there was a brief mild negotiation about whether there was anything to toast with, and someone produced a bottle of something from a cabinet that had clearly been put there for exactly this contingency. Evelyn held a glass she didn't drink from. Vincent caught her eye across the table. He looked at her with the expression she had been cataloging for 14 months and had only recently understood was not neutrality, but something more specific, a quality of attention that he deployed very selectively and that had been deployed in her direction long before she'd known it was happening. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. There was nothing in this room that needed to be said. She looked back, and the moment was exactly as long as it needed to be. And then the room was doing its closing room thing, and they were both doing their professional context thing, and that was fine. That was how it was supposed to work. Afterward, after the legal teams had gathered their documents and the Sterling people had filed out in the manner of people who had been in a high-stakes room for 2.5 hours and needed air, Vincent's chief of staff, Angela, came to Evelyn and said quietly that Mr. Moretti would like a moment when she had one. She found him in the corridor outside the conference room. He was on his phone but hung up when he saw her. There was a floor-to-ceiling window at the end of the corridor that looked south over the city, and the afternoon light was doing something specific with the skyline that she registered peripherally without fully looking at it. 14 months, she said. 14 months, he agreed. They stood in the corridor with the closed deal behind them and the city in front of them and the specific quality of people who have been through something together and arrived at a place that is neither the beginning nor the end, but something more durable than either. You said, she started, and then she stopped. He waited. In the park, she said. You said the deal wasn't what you were most interested in preserving. I did say that, he said. Was that true? She said. She kept her voice level. She was asking because she needed the actual answer and because she had spent too long in her life accepting the performed version of things without checking for the real one underneath. He looked at her with the directness she had stopped being surprised by. Yes, he said. It was true. She looked at him. You run an empire, she said. You have an organization that employs thousands of people and a legitimate business portfolio worth. I know what it's worth because I negotiated part of it, and it's significant. And you have a name that comes with a history that I read extensively before our first meeting, and I want you to know I read it, and I'm not operating under any illusions about what the Moretti name carries. He was very still. I know you're not, he said. And I'm a director of contract strategy at a financial firm, she said, which is different from what I was 2 weeks ago, but is still, I am not in your category. No, he agreed. You're not. A pause. You're in yours, she breathed. I need you to be straight with me, she said, about what this is, because I've spent 3 years building something real, and I'm not going to... She stopped, found the sentence again. I'm not going to get into something that I haven't looked at clearly. He was quiet for a moment, not the managed silence of someone constructing a response, the actual quiet of someone who is deciding how honest to be. I don't know what this is, he said. Specifically, I know what I want it to be. I want to have dinner with you without a contract on the table between us. And I want to find out what kind of person you are when you're not in crisis management mode. And I want to do that without timelines or agendas. He looked at her steadily. I also know what I am and what my name carries, and I'm not going to tell you that any of that is simple or without complication, because it isn't. She stood with that. My grandfather ran port operations, he said, and the directness of it, the absence of euphemism, was itself a kind of honesty she hadn't expected. My father built the legitimate side. I inherited both, and I have spent 20 years making the legitimate side the only side. That's the true version. It's not clean and it's not simple, and there are people in the world who will look at you differently because of whose company you keep. She looked at him. I know that. I know you know it, he said. I'm saying it anyway. She thought about the routing notes. About 14 months of someone paying attention to her name in documents that no one else at his level read. About a ballroom and a fabricated urgency, and a bench in a park, and a phone call at 11:30 at night that had asked her something she was still, quietly, answering. Dinner, she said. Dinner, he said. Saturday. He almost smiled, the edge of it, the same edge she'd been cataloging. Saturday. She went home. The apartment was the same apartment it had always been. Good light, reasonable commute, a landlord who fixed things, a kitchen table she'd sat at for 3 hours in the middle of the night, reading documents that described the deliberate dismantling of everything she'd built. The table was just a table again. The navy dress was at the dry cleaners. She made tea she didn't particularly want and stood at the kitchen window and looked at the street below. A cab, a delivery bike, 2 people walking a dog that couldn't decide which direction it wanted to go. Ordinary November street at 8 in the evening. She had been doing this for weeks now, looking at ordinary things and noticing that they were ordinary, which was the specific relief of someone coming out of a period when nothing had been ordinary, when every element of the day had carried operational weight. It was ordinary now. She was going to let it be ordinary. She thought about the person she'd been 3 years ago. The version of Evelyn Carter who had ended a relationship with a man who needed her to be smaller in order to feel large, and who had spent the following weeks and months in the specific fog of that kind of damage. The doubt that gets installed so gradually you don't notice it until you try to do something with confidence and find that the confidence has been hollowed. She thought about what it had cost to rebuild it, not dramatically, not in a way that had a clear narrative arc or a single turning point, The way it actually happens, which is in increments, in decisions. In the Tuesday mornings when you trust your own judgment and turn out to be right and file that information away. And the Thursdays when you're wrong and don't collapse from it but adjust. And the meetings where you walk in with exactly the amount of authority you've earned and no apology for having earned it. She thought about a man in a charcoal suit who had read her name in routing notes for 14 months and had thought it was worth saying out loud. She thought about Brandon on the steps, saying just her name. She felt, with a clarity that was new and that she recognized as durable, that the two things were not comparable in any meaningful sense. Not because one was romantic and one wasn't, but because one had been built over time on the evidence of what she actually was, and the other had spent 2 years trying to tell her what she wasn't. She knew which one was real. On a Friday evening, 3 weeks after the closing, Evelyn was in the Sterling Capital offices at 6:15 when her phone buzzed with a notification that would ordinarily be unremarkable. It was a social media post, tagged by someone she knew peripherally, a woman from a professional networking group, the kind of contact who sent Christmas cards and occasional article links. The post was a photograph from a charity event, a gala different from the Astoria Royale, some real estate industry function. Brandon Hayes was in the photograph. He was standing near a table, drink in hand, the same posture, the same chin slightly lifted confidence. He was alone in the photograph. No Cassandra, no audience. He was looking at something off to the left of the frame, and his expression was the expression of a man who had arrived somewhere expecting something and was recalibrating. She looked at the photograph for approximately 4 seconds. She felt nothing she hadn't already processed. She put her phone face down on the desk and went back to the document she was reviewing, and the document was a new project, a mid-size infrastructure acquisition that had come to Sterling Capital's contract team the previous week. Nothing close to the scale of Moretti Global, but real work, with real complexity, the kind of thing she was good at. She worked until 7. She gathered her things, she put on her coat, a different coat than the gala night, a good wool one she'd bought the previous week without particularly analyzing why she was buying a new coat, except that the old one had started to feel like it belonged to a previous era. She turned off the desk lamp. She stood in her office for a moment. Director of Contract Strategy and Negotiation. The nameplate on the door was new. Patricia had arranged it. Same complete sentence efficiency as everything else Patricia arranged. Her name on the door, and the good light she'd chosen the office partly for. She thought about the 14-year-old version of herself who had read the profiles of financial sector women in a library book her mother had brought home, who had wanted to be someone who built important things. She thought about the things she had built and almost lost and refused to let go of. She turned the lamp off and she left. Saturday came in cold and clear. The restaurant Vincent had chosen was not what she expected, not the kind of place that announced itself, not the kind of table that said something about the man who'd reserved it. It was small, Italian, in a neighborhood on the Lower East Side that had been the same neighborhood for 40 years, despite everything the city had tried to do to it. The kind of place where the owner knew the regulars and the menu didn't need to be impressive because the food was. He was already there when she arrived. Not because he was early, she was on time, and he had been on time before her, which she filed without comment. He stood when she came in, which was old-fashioned and genuine in a way that performed gestures never quite were. She sat. He sat. The owner brought bread without being asked. For the first 15 minutes, they talked about nothing particularly consequential, the neighborhood, the closing, a piece of news she'd read that morning about a port development in the Northeast that had implications for the infrastructure sector they'd just spent 14 months negotiating around. She asked him something about the Moretti Global team's reaction to the closing, and he told her, and then he asked her something about the new Sterling Capital oversight protocols she'd designed, and she told him, and it was the conversation of two people who were interested in the same things and who had been talking around those things for 14 months, in rooms that had contracts on the tables. Then the conversation shifted. Not dramatically, the way things shift when the professional frame lifts and you find out whether there's something underneath it. She told him about Hartford, about her mother's book group, and the furnace, and the particular quality of a childhood spent in a house with a lot of books and not a lot of money, and the specific ambition that produces in a person, the kind that isn't about status but about arrival, the need to build something that proves the dream was a reasonable one to have. He listened the way he always listened, completely, without redirecting toward himself, without performing interest. When he talked, she understood things she hadn't, from the routing notes and the professional record and the thorough research she'd done 3 years ago and again last month. He talked about his father, not the empire, the man, with the specific complicated quality of someone who has made peace with a complicated inheritance without pretending it's simple. He talked about the work of legitimacy, which was a phrase she turned over in her mind. The work of legitimacy, not the fact of it, the active ongoing daily labor of building something that could stand on its own terms. She thought she understood him better than she had. She also thought there were parts of him she didn't understand and wasn't going to understand in one dinner, and that was fine. That was correct. That was what a real thing felt like at its beginning. Not complete, not certain, but real. At some point the bread was gone and the food had come and gone, and the table had been cleared and they were the last people in the restaurant, which neither of them had noticed happening. The owner came out and did not say it was closing time, but stood in the kitchen doorway with a particular quality of waiting that communicated it clearly enough. They left. The street outside was cold and still. The Lower East Side at 10:30 doing its specific version of quiet. Not the quiet of a neighborhood that had gone to sleep, but the quiet of one that had settled into its late evening self. They walked for a while. Not toward anything. Just walked, the way she had walked on Tuesday morning, metabolizing shock, but different. The easy, unhurried walking of two people who have run out of destination and haven't decided to stop. She told him about the day she'd ended it with Brandon. Not the dramatic version. There wasn't a dramatic version. It had been a Sunday, and she had made coffee, and she had sat across from him at the kitchen table, and she had said the thing that needed to be said, and he had first not believed her, and then argued, and then become the version of himself that needed to make the leaving about something she was lacking. She had listened. She had finished her coffee. She had packed 2 bags that day and stayed with a friend for 2 weeks while she found the apartment. "Were you afraid?" Vincent said. Not sympathetically, as a real question. "Yes," she said. Not of him. Of the quiet. She thought about how to say it accurately. "I'd spent 2 years with someone who needed me to be uncertain, and the quiet after was, I didn't know what I sounded like when no one was undermining me anymore." He was quiet for a moment. "And now?" She looked at the street ahead of them. "Now I know what I sound like," she said. He nodded. One slow nod, the recognition one. "I'm going to tell you something," he said, "and I want you to take it as the true version rather than the performed one." "All right," she said. "The night at the gala, I had been looking for a reason to speak to you outside of a professional context for 7 months. He said it with the flat directness of someone who had decided that honesty was the only version of this conversation worth having. "I don't do that. I don't look for reasons. I build things deliberately or I don't build them, and there is very little in my life that happens in the gray area between those two things." A pause. "You were the gray area. I didn't know what to do with that for 7 months." She looked at him. "And then Brandon Hayes handed you a reason." "He handed me an occasion," he said. "The reason already existed." They walked another half block in the quiet. "I'm not easy," she said. "I want you to know that. I don't make things simpler by being in them. I have opinions about the right way to do things, and I am occasionally right about that in a way that is not always comfortable for the people around me." "I know," he said. "You know because of the routing notes," she said. "I know because I've been paying attention," he said, "which is the same thing." She stopped walking. He stopped. She was looking at him in the streetlight, which was not glamorous light, which was the kind of light that didn't do anyone any favors, and that showed things as they actually were. The lines of his face, the gray that was starting at his temples, the jaw that had never once in 14 months fully relaxed, and underneath all of that, the particular quality she'd first noticed in a conference room when he asked a question and then waited for the actual answer. "Saturday worked," she said. He looked at her with the expression she had finally stopped cataloging and had started simply receiving. "Yes," he said. "It did." She started walking again. He fell into step beside her. The city was the city. Indifferent, enormous, doing its 10:30 thing with or without reference to the two people walking through its Lower East Side at a pace that wasn't trying to get anywhere, and neither of them said anything for a while. And the quiet between them was the good kind, the kind that doesn't need to be filled, The kind that only exists between people who have already said the important things and are now simply occupying the same space in the same direction. 3 blocks from the restaurant, her phone buzzed. She looked at it. New project notification, a contract inquiry that had come through Sterling Capital's weekend intake system, flagged for her attention because someone had marked it as time-sensitive. She looked at the notification. She looked at the street. She put the phone in her pocket. Vincent said nothing. He had seen the motion, the decision, the pocket. She kept walking. The deal would be there Monday morning. The documents would be there. The work, the routing notes, and the access records, and the careful, patient architecture of the next thing she was going to build. All of it would be there, waiting, because that was what the work did. It waited. It was always waiting. Tonight she was walking through the Lower East Side at 10:30 with the cold air and the specific city quiet and a man who read routing notes, and that was what tonight was, and she was going to let it be exactly that. She had spent 3 years learning that the life you build in the aftermath of someone else's diminishment is the truest version of yourself. Not the one you planned before you understood what things cost, and not the one you perform for rooms full of people under crystal chandeliers, but the one you construct in the ordinary difficult days when no one is watching and the only person keeping score is you. She had built that vision. It had held. It was still holding. The streetlight at the corner caught the edge of Vincent's profile as they turned, and she looked at it briefly and looked away. And they walked on into the city, which had its own concerns and its own destinations, and which had been here long before either of them, and would be here long after, and which did not particularly care about the small human fact of 2 people walking through its streets on a cold November Saturday, having found something worth holding on to, and holding on.